We have several cases where in our system, there is no way we would place the parent with some of the people they're coming across the border with. They've been convicted for a variety of things. Child neglect, child abuse, drug trafficking, all the sorts of things that would have an American citizen's child removed from their family are the same sort of standards that we want for a child coming across the border. And of course, we want to make sure that that person who says that they're their parent or their guardian really is. So, Mr. President, you know, in this body, there are a few opportunities where you can narrowly tailor a policy to a point to where only the most partisan or unreasonable person wouldn't support it. This is one of them. We can get this bill passed, sent to the President's desk, and provide certainty, a compassionate, appropriate method for dealing with what are now hundreds or thousands of people who have come across the border, children, with their parents, treat them fairly, treat them justly, and have them processed in what I believe is the greatest judicial system that's ever existed. It's on us to solve this problem. And anybody who comes down here and says, well, no, I've got to talk about DACA, which is something I support, a path to citizenship, or I want to talk about border security, which I also support. Yeah, let's talk about that, but let's not hold these children and these families hostage for other immigration matters that this body should have the backbone to deal with the political challenges that may come from their own party and do the right thing the next time. This time, let's solve the separation of children from their parents. Let's stop playing the political games that may do the right fodder, but they're not compassionate. This time, let's solve the separation of children from their parents. Let's stop playing the political games that may do the right fodder, but they're not compassionate. This time, I want somebody to come down the children from their parents. Let's stop playing the political games that may do the right fodder, but they're not compassionate. This time, I want somebody to separate. I hope we have a clean bank. Stop playing the political games. They talk right out of the American, but that's not out of passion. This time, I want somebody to separate. I hope we have a clean bank. Stop playing the political games. They talk right out of the American, but that's not out of passion. Mr. President,
Senator from North Carolina.
I have 7 requests for committees to meet during today's session of the Senate. They have the approval of the majority and majority leaders.
Duly noted.
Minority leaders.
Duly noted.
Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Around HEB and Simmons right now because she was going to try to somewhere to get some soap to take a bath.
I saw her walking into the Timmons parking lot as I was leaving the club.
All right, guys. I'll be out there in probably 15-20 minutes.
At 2 o'clock, you're going to be at DSI Oso Bay, picking up there. I'm going to give you another 2 o'clock right down the street at Rockville, and it's going to Kingston Ports on Misty Meadow. You can drop it off right before you go to Candlewood. It's 1.96 of a mile from Misty Meadow to Airline. Port?
Yes, ma'am, but right now I'm at RTA dropping off Mrs. Brahman, and I'm going to need help for the 11 because I'm going to be heading to Cal Island or Annabelle area.
Hold on, I'll see where Sandra is. Hold on.
Well, I got to help her off, and I'll get back with you, okay? If you look at my manifest, I really would appreciate it.
What's it for?
3 bays, I'm going to have a no-show for Felicita Lopez.
Or Lori Morales.
1036 at 1043. No answer over here.
But it's okay. You might have been busy or something.
Yeah, that probably was real busy. All right, then I'll cancel it right here. I'll write down the time. 1036, 1044.
Nice, thank you.
Everything. It'll just take me a little longer to do that. There it is.
Delta 4.
I appreciate it, brother.
We're going to be changing our location.
cancellation to 1910 Morgan.
It'll be next to the door for stairwell. Door 22 for the secondary elevator number 2. I believe we're gonna have like a roof leak or something. I could see some water in that.
Well, a cancellation. I've got her on the manifest, but she's not on the monitor.
To lunch? I've been calling you.
Been out to lunch. I've been right here. I picked up, what's his name? I dropped off, what's it called, over on Evelyn, Helen, and then picked up the one on, Evelyn Navarro.
Cancel her. 11:39 cancel. Support?
Well, thank you. What one answer for?
Ready.
Ms. Fleetwood at the Colonial Apartments. Contact Maria. Your crash number is 6163-6163 and then 10-4 on your impound. It's going to be in the parking lot there. Regular mill, the fabulous be there, blackmail, camouflage shirt, black pants.
Rapid heart rate. Work off at EMS 1 at 1048.
I want to stick together. It's going to Walmart in Greenwood.
This is Cap 6.
Route 27. 27 base. Can you pick up at 11 o'clock on Charles PT 46 Corona going to Coral Reef? On Corona? Can you pick it up? 10-4 base. I gotta go back because I was on the freeway coming this way. But yeah, I can go do it. Oh, sorry. Route 26, go ahead and transfer it to Route 27. She's gonna pick it up for you. Go ahead and go up out. Said 46 Corona base. 46 Corona for Salmon and Mallard. That's not the subject of the call, is it?
No, negative. We're just checking.
10-4 base, I got it. It's at 11 o'clock. Thank you. Welcome, thank you. Looking radio check connect from the yard.
Safety 27, safety base. Just if you'd kind of look at my manifest a little bit because it's kind of tight.
I'll try. It's almost time for me to, I gotta print these routes, Francis. I'll try. I did earlier what you asked me to do. I'll try in a little bit. Route, who just left the yard? 17?
Yes, connect from the yard. Static repeat.
Okay, I have to split your route. Where are you gonna start? Your 12 o'clock?
Yeah, I think I have a 12 o'clock. I was gonna go take my lunch. Since my next one's at 12 o'clock. My 11 canceled.
I think he did. I saw her
Or Angela Johnson.
He did. He canceled. And you're on 2011?
410 base. I'm 10-8 from my place. Back on route.
Alright, I got it.
320 is
So all y'all have to cancellations and y'all would just give me a minute. After you go ahead.
Gonna be at 4001 Wildcat.
That's 150 near you.
40 copy.
Buffalo on Tancor for opposite direction, where it's that one double meter by itself.
And 450, 10 for.
4750 Moravian on a warrant.
10 for.
Daily Wells.
Charlie 3, 34.
2970.
To be eligible out of Portland, does have a restriction A as an Adam. Clear MC.
South Cocoa Parkway and South Staples. Dude, the Jerry Harris is ready early. Ready when you're ready. Just advising you.
10-4. 9 medic 9 first sick call at 1822 Stillman, 1820.
Man in you or something. I don't know. He had a real bad attitude. I didn't want to even deal with it.
Also can update work out outside dispatch at 1054.
Man in you or something. I don't know. He had a real bad attitude. I didn't want to even deal with it.
Also can update work out outside dispatch.
Man in you or something. I don't know. He had a real bad attitude. I didn't want to even deal with it. Man in you or something. I don't know. He had a real bad attitude. I didn't want to even deal with it. Man in you or something. I don't know. He had a real...
There's a bunch of apartments, but I don't see the shores. There's the stripe and you're in Ellis Johnson. It's right there to the left of you. The shores. The apartment's right there on the left. When you pull out of the stripe, go to the left and you'll see them on the left-hand side.
Alright, thank you, ma'am.
For Adam 410,
Well, Oso Bay entrance is right there next to the stripe, but right next to that is the shores.
Charlie 460. Adam 11.
I'm checking. I don't...
Comments on the call?
140, 150 clear. Look him up at a 91297 standby.
1-5, good info.
ID card expires 2025, shows eligible out of Corpus. Mike, take care for MC. He has a PI, two PIs, pedestrian walkway, pedestrian walking on roadway, and another to refuse to give name, address, and date of birth.
Please, thank you. I can only go up to 1,800 RPMs, 100 pounds, so.
Yeah, fine.
1
35. For check control, backfield full.
No, they're leaving. We'll be good.
B725 watcher, looking at ISL, we're both coming from ways off. Clear.
I'm on to help tie up this barge. Then I'll be back over there by the pump.
10-4. Adam 450, can you log me off so I can log into this?
I believe that's one of the apartment complexes or mobile home parks.
We'll take them down.
Subjects fighting. Music called bricks. Delta 110 and 130. Work off of Patrol 1.
More 2 out the Lamita. Did you advise you can't come over here?
Shannon.
We're coming from ways off to them all this call.
Charlie 40, 40 Shannon. Support.
Charlie 360, the record right now.
131. Tell what you're saying from which other unit?
For now, 130 also on that.
10-4.
Yeah, I'm gonna stable Street Station. It's gonna start hitting that way.
23 Porter Ranches, current and clear. John William George, Charlie, standby. 725-0217. Kelly.
Orinoco.
it's been pending 1 or 2 hours. All of a sudden they're claiming injury. I guess to get an officer over there.
Then hit her and choked her,
Yeah, it's
as
not
well
the
as
first
her
time
13-year-old son.
I mean,
They declined
I've heard
EMS.
it
Buzz is
before.
intoxicated.
That's what they're doing.
In a black shirt and tan shorts.
Somebody has a gun? Killing me. Alright, thanks.
Left the location. I'll repeat that Whataburger on Leopard and Ramogren. Medic 14 for a seizure at 2538 Las Brisas, 2538 Las Brisas. It's going to be for an infant that just had a seizure. It lasted a minute. First seizure. He's 4 months old. Some difficulty breathing. Advising the baby was born with drugs in her system. Or got fire dispatch at 1104.
Factory. 14 Johnson Henry 1804.
San Henry 1804. Reporting party 56 from Ricardo pulling into Burlington 10-4. Evidently the son didn't have a driver's license and he took the vehicle. Contact Christina 876-0896.
5.5 Sunrise Avenue.
On the line advising the
That's to change my call.
The call's still being updated. There's no specific on injury.
6 forwarding, cancel engine 6, 10-4, engine 6, I'll show you code.
Those 4, 10-4.
Anita Lara.
Yeah, I can't get into the system, Jesse.
Alright, well then I'm gonna have to no-show her. I've already been driving around the block like 3 times already. There's no place to park here. I can't park on the street on Santa Fe. Around 27 showing eligible as far as 20. I just had a rear grand call her, I'll go around the block again and have her meet me somewhere because I can't park here. There's no way. Even on the side, all the cars are all parked up. I don't know, everybody's having heart trouble or something. But I can't park.
2905 and a half.
Is it the heart clinic?
2905 and a half.
202 Santa Fe.
They're requesting EMS reference someone
Hold on, she's gonna see if she can get
they're having
over.
a disturbance with. Information still coming in. Client stage for scene safe. We'll get off.
Help me on that. Whoever else is coming.
I'm behind you. 10-4, thank you, babe. I'll see if she can come up, if I can find her. Thank you.
10-4.
A trauma injury pain. Trauma injury pending 1822 Stillman. Guy's walking away. Someone else called in for him and he's refusing EMS.
10-4. Another one's gonna arrive.
Red. Can you bring me some felony packets?
Yeah, Staples and Weber. Do you want to touch the unit or just make it below?
Hey, just below it.
Okay, 10-4.
2737 Chimney Rock. 7902 left for the vent.
375, get a case number? I'm on my way to you. I actually think it's water, but I will be there momentarily.
Staples and Weber, general area at 1241.
Room quarters? Stand by.
Base, I know you're busy, but I'm over here at the villa. Is there any way you could call Becky Thomas to come out because the parking lot is packed? I can't even get in.
I don't have the internet.
1241.
All the call takers are on the phone. I don't have access.
Bravo 188 came from 2794. Correction, the call came from the pool. And the call for all the impounds? The pool? Okay. Didn't even know they had one. 2010 for minor injuries. Charlie 1.
Battalion 4 to contact you.
Hey, it's over here on the stop sign. Bravo 150, I can see the emergency phone box. There's nobody at the pool area.
150, 10-4.
Yes, clear.
11326 Leopard. Contact spot east. Contact Mary.
I don't want
trying to take an employee's vehicle.
B77 southbound County Road.
Hispanic female, long sleeve shirt with the number 18 in blue jeans. Victims refusing medics.
120, 10-4. 11.
15, 10-4. 91.9, 10-4.
An employee that forgot her keys. You let an employee in that forgot her keys. American door?
You say you had 2 pickups for me. I'm ready for that 1043.
He came back negative 29 all the way around. I didn't get a 27 on him.
Where's the calling contact?
Alright.
If I read?
Yeah, that's good. 26, King Tom Tom
24, 1070 off of County Road 91.
Static, building 26, King Tom Tom 1257.
Marvin Tatum. Still at Stillman and Nueces. 10-4.
Baldwin is Balboa. 505 Dixon for the Guadalupe who?
Sir Rodriguez, 505 Dixon Drive, has an 1118 pickup going to the Starflex Movie Theater, 5218 Silverberry Drive. 5218 Silverberry Drive.
16 apiece, I'm gonna take lunch, 11:18, 12:18, ma'am. I'm gonna go by there, break up, get a plea and run out of there.
Gonna be at the Butcher Park.
Making it a smaller street, possibly Marine Avenue. Again, I'll try to get you the street here. It is going to be a smaller street, possibly Marine Avenue. They are, and you will typically the area. We can see that CHP though getting very close. Situation, a nice wide 4-lane street with no car.
29 for intimidation. Last 4 is 3563.
Oh, squeezing by those.
Stand by. Warrant out of.
Is Dixon the one over here by Greenwood, or is that the one over there by Leopard?
Bro, 452.
Off of Villa. Dixon is off of Villa. Dixie is off of Greenwood.
Negative, not requesting.
Get him confused. Thank you.
Setting your location.
7373.
You fucking me makes me bilingual. Between your lips and I want it between mine. And I struggle as you lick, torturing me. I try to get away, but not really. Running out of room, begging for more. Up against a wall that has been stuffed by my stilettos. Again, you pry apart my thighs and tell me to be still, not willingly submit to you because I love the way you dominate me. Demanding that I come for you, so I do as I'm told. You've molded me so I'm good to no one else but you. You conquered this once orgasmicless world and multiplied it again and again. My face radiates with afterglow. My pillow scented by you. A fragrance was haunt me. My room smells of the best sex I, covered in body prints and fingerprints of you above me. Your name written indelibly upon my body in your genetic history. You fucking me makes me bilingual. bilingual. You fucking me makes me bilingual. You fucking me makes me bilingual.
Morgan Kilo with DP10. Under 358. Yeah, good 30 clear, 170 clear. Yeah.
10 record rest.
30. Elisa
Right,
Ann
driver out to the
3856. Elisa Ann. Contacted Nicholas Flores.
Yes, sir. I'm clear headed to the middle zone.
With the girlfriend, Aaliyah, 24-year-old female. Is available. Inside the house, had a history of cutting herself, but no weapon.
Yeah, I can get it. I just wanted to make sure you got their info.
Yeah, what was her date of birth? If you don't have it, I can run her deal and get it.
I see that right now, 5756 South Staples. And then you have... That's okay, base. I got it. Thank you. I already tried 3 times and you keep on telling me you got it. Alright, 10-4, continue on route 1022, route 11, 1022.
2970, 10-4.
9901 to base. I'm leaving 11th Street at 11:30. Thank you, route 11.
Frank William 6619.
Well, go ahead.
This is Medic 14. We're in around code 1 to your facility with a 4-month-old female. She's conscious alert. She's acting age appropriate at this time. Patient's mother states the patient was down for a nap and they noticed her grunting and possibly short of breath. Mother did witness some seizure-like activity for approximately 20 seconds. Or approximately 32, and she's 98% on room air.
425. Check 1 for 2927.
Number on this call, please.
969 access northbound for an 86-year-old elderly female with low hemoglobin and low blood pressure, 148/68, slightly tachycardic. Call for updating, work off of fire dispatch at 1133.
Make a copy. Again, do you have the second? I need to adjust one name on the call. And grandfather's name. The subject started his argument with.
Not eligible. Expired in 20. Get a default on installment agreement. Address 6225 Saratoga.
Off over the front. I just wanted to make sure that was all.
Meet in about 5 minutes.
What you need to change?
The name I need to change is for Lori Polito. Last name, spelling is going to be Paul Union Lincoln.
Highway 268, Eastbound and Weber. Highway 268,
First name is going to be
West Eastbound and Weber. It's going to be the parked in front of the car wash. Requesting an acute neck and shoulder pain. RP's in a gray Ford Focus conscious and breathing. Also updating. Work off of EMS 1 at 11:35.
7, we'll head over there.
And then 10-4 ladder 7, I'll show you clear and available.
Show us available.
Can you show us around?
Show me out at 5933 Parkview, reference info.
And service retrained.
08, 10-4.
It'll be Violet in Windsor. It's going to be Boy 273261.
Boy 273261, 500 Windsor.
21, go freeze. 4621, go freeze. Call you to recent golden. 3-4-52-year-old female. Breathing, has high blood pressure, sweating, won't wake up. Information is still coming. PD being advised. 1 on EMS 1 at 054.
So?
Yeah. Also, the only one I think when the chiefs come, I just sent him to St. Marville.
First name is Robert, Young Nora.
Should we report a break-in or just suspicion? The one that's been pending for over an hour. They gain entry or she's even still there?
Try to come on the way, do you want them to advise? Just have the shots heard pending, staples in Alameda, PI subject at Fajitaville, an alarm call, and a suspicious subject on Sabina.
Adam 430, Adam 4.
Across the street. In the store? Check out.
Okay, I got the 18-wheeler here. I'm at one of the days there, but is the other party there at the Exxon?
Medics are there as well.
Reynaldo.
Where does 420?
UB is going to be 126 to 51.
That PI subject down might be. I'll take that by it's in for 40.
29 all the way around, no 27, return on him.
10-4. What you got?
02 Saratoga coming to Yale, or affordable dentures going to 5501 Candace. Both of them are same day. One for Alfonso and the other one for Elida.
We'll go get Alfonso base because my next pickup's here at Dillon.
I came over to the scene. I guess you guys are at the pickup point.
Yeah, he's loaded up. He calmed down once he was away from the
An ID card expired 23, address 2624 Waterloo.
Hey, I didn't think about mentioning this as recent, but remember that guy that was wanted for the Agasols, and then he ended up, I guess the guy died that Friday that we were over there on Mary. Anyway, he's already out. He's on an ankle monitor. They picked him up for the warrant, but 10-4.
I don't remember that part. That's not one of the witnesses.
Second plate, Boy Tom.
It was Lewis. It was
Show up on that.
Marion, Keith Lewis.
What are y'all seeing?
He's on an ankle monitor now, but they let him out already. But I guess he was one of the guys that was wanted for the ag assault, and then on Friday the guy that I guess they assaulted passed away. Yeah, just in case you guys make calls over here during this. He's at that house.
I'll holler.
Oh, what's up for?
It's Staples and Holland. 110 from lunch.
110. I have one at affordable dentures going to 5501 Candace for Elia Dominguez.
En route in a maroon Buick.
10 for David Henry David, 9851, entrance is confirmed. Julie?
Thank you. Centering now, simple.
Contact, they're working on the system. In servicing quarters.
10754, in servicing quarters. 1109, clear.
Starting mileage 44.2.
Point 2 at 1146.
That's 181. I'm clear my part.
181's clear?
Yes, sir.
On 1144 is a white WCA going to south.
Can you take my half and pull it for
Anybody assist, please?
for any up on island?
I can probably squeeze in that Applebee's.
Appreciate it.
What are you, Route 11?
4, ma'am. Heading that way.
Yeah, Jenner, boys, you gotta take my half on that suicide. Out here on the minor with the
Copy, Route 30.
In base. Movies.
1022, Route 11. She's already putting in there.
You want to give him the one right after that so I can get back on schedule?
I'll do that. I didn't see those on your route. I'll go ahead and do that. And, Arnold, go for, Salunga. Route 11, you continue for that other one.
And then, in retaliation, that other guy, Gilbert, broke the Impala window.
You know there are 3 windows broke on the BMW?
No, I saw one for sure, the windshield.
Rear window was broke, and then both windows on the driver's side were broke.
Probably about 400 or 500 for the side.
So I put 1,000 for the BMW and like 300 for the Chevy.
Yeah, more like 12 to 1,500 for the BMW.
To the base.
25. Since yesterday.
Picasso, Jose Ramirez at 1625. Route 23.
Ricardo, Boy Henry
Route
Boy,
17,
2742.
cancel your 1320 for Ricardo Gomez and Jacaranda.
Boy Henry Boy 2742, 10-4.
Today from lunch? Alright, 10-4, I'll note it. And then, Route 27. 1230, Route 23.
23 copy, Lee. Thank you. Who was the other one?
Javier Salazar, and let me see who the other one is.
Airport 1645.
2415.
Arrived at 1043. Last name Lucio, first name David, date of birth 10/14/71.
Robert 5150.
No, Robert 5150.
Then 241, so I assume that's building 2, correct?
Semi-clear.
You want 10-4?
And EMS out to the shoreline for a male 20 that's probably going to have a panic attack. He is sweating profusely. Outside front doors.
21 clear.
And we're trying to get information from him, but it's
Medic 6, engine 14 for a trauma injury at Dr. Captain's office, 6,000 South Staples. 6,000 South Staples, Suite 406, Office of Folgers and Sarrazin Drive, for a male patient who slipped and fell through the window, cut his hand, applying pressure, unable to stop the bleeding, conscious and breathing. Call for updating. Work off EMS 1 to 1155.
Very good copy. Shoreline beginning mile 0.1.
Insurance on the vehicle for me? Medic 2, code 1, shoreline beginning mileage 0.1.
Henry William Frank 0492.
9901 crossing into Port Aransas at 11:55 on the ferry.
16 Leopard, callers declining contact.
Sequel 121 North Shoreline. 121 North Shoreline at the Waterford Rock Shoreline.
Two males,
He's a 20-year-old
male in a
male,
white
sweating, possibly having a panic attack.
tank top
We'll be at the front
black t-shirt and like regular blue jeans, took a large bag of items from the donation box at HEB, left on foot towards navigation.
The 27, it expired back in 99.
51159. 51159.
Suspended for surcharge due for no insurance, 118 of 07.
450 set register when ready.
The 420.
2466.
Stand by.
Shows available, please.
That's 130, clear.
About 10 minutes.
King at Oakland apartment 1737 Charles, RP decline contact. 22 of 86. Okay. Hold it.
Show me 10 cleared. I'll be in route to HQ. Gonna be taking your call.
Back from lunch, I was gonna take an hour from 11:30 to 12:30, but I only took half an hour. From 11:30 to 12 o'clock. Continue. I got a couple appointments at 5:40.
So it was just from 11:30 to 12? Is that what you said, sir?
Ma'am, 11:30 to 12.
Bravo,
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
So one adult female one clear.
23 at 104.
Brad, 4
Your
base.
case number is going to be 80008.
1044. Thank you so much for all your help today. Go ahead and come on in. Be safe.
And 4 copy, thank you. 4 clear.
Robert Henry 511.
base. Okay, after you jump off at Seabreeze, can you pick up a 1427 Bay Area Medical Center going to Juarez? You can bring him in after you stop and pick up with the Whataburger on Member. You can drop him off. And then go to Domingo
What's the
Peña.
make and caliber? Is it 5 Miller?
So much, sir.
They're supposed to be stolen out of our agency. 4834 Yorktown.
That information to Delta 316
on 2034.
Stand by.
10-4. I've also attached the hit to where y'all look at the normal supplemental information.
Back in service. Yeah, and I guess
you try
your
again?
name and number, take it out of the system.
You'll actually take it out. It'll go to records and they'll remove it.
10-4, that's right. Okay, thank you.
Charlie 110.
Charlie 220 traffic.
20 location.
First high L.
South Street with Horn.
Prescott.
Bravo
150, Bravo 160. It's going to be 2 vehicles, one beige GMC van and the other a white Jeep. RP is a passerby. 045.
And thank you very much.
None from the involved party. 4002, Cambridge.
Stand by. That you arrived, but I couldn't understand the last year traffic.
57.
Adam 110-4.
Violet Court is the one, it's the one right here behind the hospital. Court. 2019 Violet Court. That's over at Navarro.
What are you showing?
The track.
This person, 910 Corn Products, 910 Corn Products at America's Best Value in room 22304. Contact Lupita at the front desk.
BDC, she may not be hearing the radio.
That's what I'm gonna do. How do I do the first trip from here going home? I put a cancel at the door and then make him another same day? It's gonna be a no-show unless you take him home. That's why it's always better for you to take the passenger where the destination is and then call us back, and then we'll make him a same day to where he originally wanted to go. That way he won't get a no-show.
He said it's okay, but Roger now.
Vehicle and the property were injured. I don't know what else I needed.
If not, if you don't have it, you alwaady email it.
There's 2960 on a call right now, calling airlines.
They weren't armed, but they were trying to separate these individuals. That's kind of what started. You had their names, or got their names.
Oh, sorry, I got Grandpa's name. Yeah, let me enter him. You want me to put him as an O?
Yeah, it's simple.
At Papa and Alpha, a T-45, 2 people on board, unknown hazmat, and 200 gallons of fuel.
West, just over Fairlane, on Frank Zebra John 1197.
Adam, once again.
Disturbance at the RTA, Westbound Justice for Fayetteville, an alarm call, suspicious call at Sabinas, and a medical commitment at Mother Teresa.
4718 Leopard Quad.
3200 Morgan, Henry Paul Sam, 4470.
MEChANiCAL Morgan, 10-4.
For Alonso Calunga at 5802 Saratoga. Did you pick them up? Okay, really quick. Route 19. TGV.
Miss, he busted a windshield for a vehicle and he has a pocket knife threatening to stab the reporting party.
T-30, right?
I'm picking him up there. Okay, thank you, 10-4. Just checking.
With a 45-year-old female complaining of abdominal pain to the right upper quadrant.
Miller's Barbecue in Annabelle, 10-4. Yes, thank you.
Oh, this was rated for. She just rated at the 9 out of 10. Last set of vitals was 152/86, heart rate at 102. Monitor is showing sinus pattern. OG Century is 99% room air. She is rated treat myself in animal rapid. Temp was 99.1. The BGL 103. We do have a 20 gauge established in left AC. We are currently running fluids. ETA facility is about 5 to 7 minutes.
They're serving lunch for Employee Appreciation Day.
Damn, I'm all the way out in the bluff.
All right.
Be advised, we're going to have City set up a triage station at the Del Mar hangar.
4634 Franklin.
Agonist and Brownlee on the 20th.
230 run. PD Walmart in 5 points till 5 o'clock.
Block of Ocean, 10-4.
Oh, okay, 10-4, thank you.
We're out today.
Just pushed him into the pop parking lot. Next, MCs, negative anti-CIC and TSC, 2 MCs, 1 for PI, communication, 2 copy that, 27. Can you check both to see if they're clear?
Roger.
Bravo 150 vehicles out of the river.
150, 10-4.
With off duty.
Too much for all your help. Come on in and join us.
10-4. Is fire station. Yeah, if you can update it, 1938 minutes, jobs 901. We set up triage, everyone's walking, few bumps and bruises, but they're all okay.
Bar 160, 10-4, Bar 150, if you come back
There's
from
going to be a BL, showing clear, expired 2009, same address.
Clear frequency for emergency message. Clear frequency for emergency message.
Exercise, exercise, exercise. All airport units stand down from the Alert 3 drill at this time.
Just be advised, I got clearance to back to the RTA.
I'm clear, coming. Charlie 120, 10-4.
Ready on patrol 1.
Are you available for a minor or failure to maintain financial responsibility, expired registration and speeding. 27 is showing eligible, expires 22. Address 953 Cross Publicity.
Hold on.
This is in for me, please.
Just got the same day right now.
Is it in?
Red cow. Where are you at?
Looks like Frank.
I'm right here, Miss, I'm a girl named SPID. I just dropped off Deborah, Venezuela.
Okay, hold on. Did y'all put in that same day? Hold on. Did y'all put in that?
There's no information on the vehicle at this time. Contact Jason.
Okay. Thank you so much. Yeah, porque tienes la código 25, 945.
170.
It's driving away.
Charge 6 complete.
2260, go ahead.
John Henry 3780.
Are you last transport location, stable Saratoga?
Charlie, we're okay. We're pulling into the IBC.
Silver in color. Expired December 2018. Do you need the name and address?
450 don't. No, the field's not here, and I was getting license plate off of, I just want to make sure it's the right vehicle.
Number 20.
How are you, Pat?
Negative.
Sorry, I'm working.
40.
I had contact with the guy who stayed and they agreed to 18 it, so I'll be glad altogether. Alcohol use today. Out of 120, 125. Out of 1 or 2.
20 clear.
120, Delta, 1 or 2. No. SP for 1 Memorial 0.0 temper. Look at this. Hey, where's old Kenny been? I haven't heard old Kenny Brown in a while. Where's he been? He's at jury duty. My goodness. I'm sure he'll get picked on a panel. Medic 14, dispatch. Show me on special assignment until 1:45. 10-4.
2011, it started blowing hot air in the back. The lady
Eligible expires 21 due to surcharge at DWLI, address out of Yoakum.
unit do you have?
And for
2011.
Rivera, 27 showing eligible, expires 19, address out of
You
Yoakum.
mean that was taken into 20, was it? No, it's a Kelly. I'll get with Gary just to kind of talk to them. I'll kind of think about that. For absorbent for an oil spill. Walking off by dispatch at 117.
Injuries or just PD?
Yeah, let's send them out for now, till we can figure it out.
For Medicaid for trauma, 46.
Majority lead, we're in phone call. We are.
Medicaid for trauma, 46.
Without objection.
I ask consent that the order for the Bounds nomination be initiated.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Work on fire dispatch at 1227.
For the information of all senators, the nomination will be withdrawn. I suggest that in the court.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Rescue 3 major vehicle accident, Morgan at 286 access to 2 red vehicles in the roadway. Time one's on scene, advising possible injury, work off EMS 1, 1228.
Copy.
Medic 3, copy.
Back to the fire department in reference to a residential fire.
Female, been vomiting, conscious breathing, noisy breathing. Work off fire dispatch at 1229.
302 or 305.
Clear my part over here, but I need
302, I'm still
the job station to fix a tire.
1 Leopard, Nueces County Courthouse. It's going to be patient conscious breathing, attempted to hang himself, difficulty breathing. Work off EMS 1 at 1229.
Where's your traffic? Base on King William Boy 1048.
Medic, can you repeat?
Frequency for emergency message. Frequency for emergency message.
Okay, go down, stand by.
Exercise, exercise. This message is for public safety only. We have a fuel spill of 10 gallons of gas at Signature.
I'll be taking command.
9901A, pending 11th Street.
Breathing is all jittery, just for lack of a better word.
In the area patrol for 119.
50410, I'll take my call, I mean. Rescue 4 to command, we'll be applying a quick drive to the scene.
Command, copy.
Victor Adam Sam. First name is spelled Roger Ocean George Edward Lincoln Ida Ocean Junior 920 of 91.
160-10-4.
Democratic leader.
May we have some order, Mr. President?
Senate will be in order.
Thank you. I ask unanimous consent that the
Senate's in a phone call.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the consideration of Senate Res 584 as under the previous order, and that I be permitted to speak briefly about it.
Is there objection? Without objection. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session to consider the following resolution, which the clerk will report.
Senate Resolution 584, expressing the sense of the Senate against the making available of current and former diplomats, officials, and members of the armed forces of the United States for questioning by the government of Vladimir Putin.
Mr. President.
Democratic leader.
Now, I'm hopeful that we will come together on this resolution, which I introduced with the senator from New Jersey and the senator from Hawaii. That is neither the policy nor the practice of the United States to submit our citizens, let alone our ambassadors, to the interrogation of a foreign adversary. Let this resolution be a warning to the administration that Congress will not allow this to happen. I call on President Trump to say once and for all, not through his spokespeople, that the lopsided, disgraceful trade he called an incredible offer is now off the table. There should be no equivocation on the matter. And one more point, Mr. President. May we have order, Mr. President?
Senate will be in order.
I am so disappointed in the failure of the resolutions earlier today. We had a real chance for bipartisanship. The resolutions were modest and mild, and they were just resolutions. But we couldn't even come to agreement on those. Our Republican colleagues, given the crisis we have in foreign policy, have to step up to the plate and join us, not just in resolutions, but in bipartisan action that is so important. I was told that one of the reasons that the resolution was objected to was because they didn't even want us to get the notes, let alone hear from the translator of this 2-hour mysterious meeting where nobody seems to know what has happened. The American people should know what has happened. The Senate should know what has happened. Our leaders in the State Department and Defense Department should know what happened. And our colleagues on the other side of the aisle seem to be too afraid to let us bring that up. That is so wrong for the security of America. I am hopeful there are bipartisan efforts going on today that we can not do what we did earlier and block the resolutions by the senator from Vermont and the bipartisan resolution from the senators of Arizona and Delaware, but move together in real action to undo the damage, try to undo the damage that the president has done to this country this week. Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Questions on the resolution? Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr.
For a call to your NBC.
Thank you, sir.
I'm at Kalakaua, Antelope, but I don't see anything yet.
Roll 440, I'm clear, 736.
440, 10-4.
Hey, do you have Wally's number?
Do not.
Make sure you text me your first, last name. I guess that's all I'll need for to send them in our time.
Definitely, you're on to Charlie 4's location.
NPID, Henry Lincoln Sam 2011.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Carden. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey.
We're walking down Tripoli.
Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins.
Curve 1, Shoreline 0.1. Father, in reference to a vehicle that ran the RP off the road, came running the RP with a weapon. I don't know what kind of weapon it was.
Mr.
White male,
Coons.
brown shirt. Currently, the vehicle is parked on the location.
On the air right now.
Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Got you, thank you.
5-5, can you possibly jump back over to La Paz Street?
Mr. Cotton, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Daines, Mr. Donnelly. Yes, sir, I do. Thank you. Okay, I got it. Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Gardner, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Ms. Harris, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hatch.
Figuring out how many impounds we need and everything. You got some of it? Right. I guess whatever Noah says, I say first.
Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp.
5.5 hours, right?
Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono.
Send me your info and I'll text it to Wally.
Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Height-Smith. Mr. Inhofe.
Mom said the last time he hunkered down for a while. I
I think he ran towards one of the backyards, and he might have found a hiding place and hunkered down back here somewhere. So we're going to go back over here and search it. I'll give
Mr.
you the
Isaacson.
exact address in a minute.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Lankford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz.
Port Charles Paul Tom 6982.
Mr. Schumer.
Location 4 in Francis.
Mr. Scott. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
31 times 4, 1527, where do you need him?
Yes, sir, I'm here at the location. There's nobody with a bike. Sorry, I'm not involved on it, Marker. Can you call the number? Over here in the JFK. Doing it right now.
5, 2, Young.
Senators voting in the affirmative. Barrasso, Bennett, Blunt, Bozeman, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Capito, Collins, Coons, Corker, Hornan, Cortez Masto, Cotton, Crapo, Dames, Durbin, Fisher, Flake, Gardner, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Heller, Hoven, Hyde-Smith, Isaacson, Johnson, Jones, Kennedy, King, Klobuchar, Lee, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Perdue, Portman, Risch, Roberts, Rounds, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Smith, Sullivan, Tester, Thune, Udall, Warner, Warren, Whitehouse, Wicker, Wyden, and Young. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Cruz,
Heading towards the HEB port control.
aye.
Control 2, 130.
Adam 40. Adam 40, Adam 4. Arrest you, please.
Bravo 40 clear. 10-4, you have another unit for that Scotch Moss call? That's a close trailing unit, stand by.
Mr. Toomey, aye.
13, 10-4.
Charlie 470 for burglary in progress. 2414 Scotch Moss, 2414 Scotch Moss.
two males that were wearing masks.
Mr. Inzi. Aye. Mr. Tillis.
White two-door car.
Aye.
The RP didn't know if it actually belonged to them or they broke into it. They're last thing going towards Cimarron.
Bravo, 440, 10-4.
You're 10-4, Charlie 470 clear.
Best Betty at Garment Bay Apartments.
Charlie 430, one's wearing a red hoodie and shorts, the other's wearing an orange hoodie and shorts.
375, 1048 to switch over.
Patch to least 2.
Step on vehicle.
Right towards Cimarron.
Plane clear, sir. And they call shots, heard intends NA, suspicious person in 40s.
She wants to report, but it's declining.
Alexander. Aye.
She said she's been back to the house with them ever since she left the hospital, and there's been no violence or no peaceful violence.
She can't go stay somewhere else, at least for the night.
Mr. Casey.
I can ask her, sir. Like I said, she declined to press charges. I tried to push her in that direction, but she said she didn't want to.
40 adult man CDC, 134.
Of the injury and, there's no reason to 12 him right now.
Can you advise you clear?
I'd encourage her to go stay somewhere else for the night, maybe a family member or somebody to stand by for her, so we'll stand by with you.
10-4, will do.
Mr. Cassidy. Aye.
5117 Embassy.
117 Embassy, 10-4.
Clear.
Ms. Stabenow. Aye.
26 location.
Mr. Donnelly. Aye.
10-4. Sorry, 330.
44 and FM 70.
In contact. It's actually going to be a fall. Injured at this time.
400.
318, I'll take his mark.
Ms. Duckworth.
Clear.
Aye.
Yeah, 10-4, thank you.
Mr. Van Hollen. Aye.
Yes.
Number is 90009.
Yeah, me at 595 Crooked Creek.
58 Crooked Creek.
Ms. Harris. Aye.
We have CDC for 8 minutes.
318, send me a message.
Destruction progress. Carmen at Cortez. Hispanic male in a white shirt and black shorts throwing bottles in the middle of the street.
You have a cross street for North Navarro.
Gonna cross with...
This is happening at 3510 or is that what you call it?
Public. We 12 them using the back of the unit. Barely. We're going to have transport over here. It's very, very large.
Mary Adam Young, Robert Adam, middle name Alejandra, Adam Lincoln, Edward John Adam Nora, David Robert Adam, date of birth 10/12/1995.
Side window.
This is Gillibrand. Aye. Mr. Booker. Aye.
2340, 10-4.
Mrs. Feinstein. Aye.
320, 10-4.
There's a 2021 53250 Brown over Brown.
Mr. Sass.
Adam for 40.
Aye. Mr. Kane.
88
Aye.
And Nick just called in. If you can go like where I'm at on the opposite side, they're going to be picking up cones like going towards the Agnew.
I didn't see no bottles anywhere. I know they're cleaning out the dumpster and they were dumping bottles in the dumpster. Maybe that's what they're hearing, I don't know.
Mr. Carper, aye.
I'm not coming through. You guys in front of the building?
We're clear out park. 2926 Edward, Lincoln, Edward, Nora, Adam, 01-02-1988.
Wood, Norton, and Brentwood. A vehicle flipped over in the yard, blue truck. Still waiting on nature of injuries. One at 148.
Medic 1B responding. We don't know if he made force entry and squatting at the apartment or if he actually lives here, but there's an open door. I'm sorry, open window, but he's not cooperating with us.
Mrs. Ernst. Aye.
David, DLB at 122477. Can you fax his 27 over to CDC, please?
Over once they didn't get it.
Ma'am.
I'll resend it over.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, sure, Claire. Yeah, what Charlie 410 reference a subject that's at that location about an apartment?
Yeah, you said Charlie 410?
Do you know how to get a hold of the management? Getting some resistance for a guy who... We got a call for a disturbance. He's not wanting to open the door, but he has a window wide open. We don't know if he made entry or what. It looks like he...
That one call to like, for 56 minutes.
Blood on his... a little bit of blood on his hand and his shirt. And there's shoes outside.
Hey, you cut up a little bit. Do you have your phone on you?
Negative. Hold on a second.
No.
Yeah, you read me now. Good.
This is better. I'm sorry. You said there's a guy in an apartment. You guys are trying to talk to him.
Yes,
he has the window open, but he's not coming out.
Yeah, 10-4. He's not wanting to open the door, but we don't know if the person that he's fighting is inside. He has a mark on his arm. The window is wide open, as if he took the screen off and then opened the window as such. I'll be transporting you now. 140. Starting miles
38114 to 4.
Karaoke party. You can show us there now. This one. Charlie 460 10-4 and Charlie 455 sharing with them for the call pending. 4 now.
The 360 traffic? 10746 Rockwood. Contact is rapid decline contact. It'll be Staples and Buford.
Buford Kingling, however.
Ms. Hirono. Aye.
It is going to be a single vehicle. There's no driver.
Mr. Reed.
We're no driver in the vehicle.
Aye.
Being called in third party, alleging that the mother and father are arguing. The Belinda Gonzalez, 54 years of age.
It's going to be a paper plate.
Mr. Carden.
01521
Aye.
John 3. 01521 John 3. And was that 10-4 to make it an impound? Yeah, I'm making it an impound. 460 10-4.
My name's King Frank John 779.
460 10-4.
The 450 arriving.
10-4. 9953. Boise Zebra X-ray 9953. Boise Zebra X-ray 9953.
455 ready. 455 10-4. Charlie 460. Alarm company didn't give you any knowledge of what zone 12 is?
Mr. Leahy, aye.
I'm reading it says it's not unit 12. Somebody put that on the common. Delta 471. 12 on the zone only.
Somebody, let me check. Unit numbers.
Subject, last name
Do you want me to read it off to you, or do you want to tell me which one you have?
82185. Can we check for prior GWR?
599. The next one is 14008. And the last one is 140077400.
10-4. The first one was 140103599. What was that one for? Delta 450, Delta 440.
72729, last name is Patel, Paul, Adam, Tom, Edward Lincoln.
Negative TCIC, NCIC, 2 possibilities on the 27.
Mr. Peters, aye.
Adam, Robert.
10-4, can you tell affirmative access to 60?
First one, state of birth.
91274.
Mr. Graham,
Nora,
aye.
First name is Ruben, 11286.
Arrive, Indian mileage 4.0.
Expires August 713, 1999 Dodge pickup, blue in color, to Oscar Rodriguez, 1718 Bernardino, the city. Until Toyota 4Runner.
That's gold.
No, it's 29, but it's no extradition. Has a driver's license that's not eligible. It doesn't have an expiration date. 511-200 black over brown. Showing subject Ruben has 2 possibles for 27. And also Ruben has a MC bench warrant for possession.
Mr. Inhofe, aye.
Mariah, she's spelling it Mary, Adam, Robert, Ida, Adam, Henry. Middle name is Lynn, Susan, Young, Nora, date of birth 11/6/1999.
Yeah, do we have a street name in Corpus Christi?
Go ahead with the
on the south side.
Boy Zebra X-ray 9953. Repeat, Boy Zebra X-ray 9953.
Boy Zebra X-ray 9953.
Devil.
2023, 53130 brown over brown, and insurance is confirmed.
Engine 1 for commercial fire alarm, 3938, zero side at Villa de Sol, 3938, zero side at Villa de Sol, cross rate with...
Can you call back RP and have her come back to our location, please?
Charlie 410, 10-4. Charlie 350, straight clear. 350, 10.
Can you call my RP back and let her know that it's the police officer at the door?
Charlie 455, 10-4.
She's still on the phone with you?
Officer,
turn off
need a separate
Tell her that it's the officer that came out here yesterday. You spoke with her for like an hour. She should remember me, hopefully.
Still investigating.
The event number.
Nothing showing investigating somewhere.
Can you send me another?
Mr. Langford,
That should be open.
Patient will be back 13651 Claudia. 4051 Claudia.
I'll be about to the substation. I'll be 10-7 for the remainder.
For a 64-year-old patient, conscious breathing, left Stage 1 on service returning. False alarm. Working off. Fire dispatch at 1. Routine around. Active disturbance team, male and the female. It is now pocket rate. Now advised to be a male and a female actively arguing in front of the location. They represent assault. 10-4, just connect to my train. Still not outside. The last one are all three. No, they haven't worked. They haven't gotten a key holder. Halfway line. Charlie, go ahead and sign me that other call. I'm en route.
Mr. Blumenthal, I.
Can you fax that warrant to CDC?
Last name's going to be Ramirez. Last character, zebra. First name Fabian. Date of birth 071090. I got some guys here at Valid. No, y'all smoke now.
For PI.
The pallet, somebody close.
Showing not eligible. Expired 15. Has an ID card that expires 24.
311. Copy Texas. King Lincoln Robert 7019.
Please eligible.
359. Can you show me out for fuel?
74. 306, Sam. Find me a case number, please. Mobility, I'll be clear 5-8. Unfortunately, 358 American.
Unfortunately, copy.
Show me out of that. 420. You can clear 410.
Last name
Porter.
First name Jackie. Charlie 460, Charlie 440, check your screen for call. Screen for call.
Delta 470 case number, please.
Gone before our arrival. We're in the area checking, but get clear everybody.
Frank Robert.
The comments going.
John Tom Zebra 8151. Charles X-ray 9, George 873.
Charlie 310's in the area. 81.
Ms. Baldwin, I.
Delta 440, show the same traffic. Delta 44, Delta 3060.
1531.
Go ahead.
There's people coming from that side. You're getting too close, walking this way. Fire department's advising you can have them tell them to get down. Stay away.
Okay, I'm moving the for the electric department.
0434.
But I'll get on it. 6700 Leopard, George North Victor 0434.
Delta 370 to 360.
Videotape. Gonzalez and E.
Oh my. Alright, me and RJ are gonna head that way too, just in case.
Mr. Paul, I.
357. Occurred. Let's give an estimated address at 3633 Leopard.
The Woods. King John Henry 2317. And Nora Young 5590.
Nora Young 5590. Holly Inglewood 4. I'm clear.
You can address the call ping directly on the value bank.
Delta 460.
60.
I mean, another unit over here. I got Melvin Smith over here.
She's advising that she's across the street at the school.
Yeah, 4.
Highway's open.
10-4, highway's open.
20, you need to know that there's nothing on hand.
Motor 46.
Yes, well. Seeing that backup, he's taking off now on his own.
10-4, and Delta 230, he was at Stables in Morgan. He's now canceling.
440 clear.
Clear. PS, handle the accident. I'll have to give him a call if they got discharge station from the call. I'll call you back to info when I get a hold of him.
Okay, I'll step
The call was found as a robbery in area vicinity of Bolo. No stole cigarettes and ran out of the store. There's no suspect information. What do you got, Mike?
Delta 420, I'm clear, comments. 711? Tom, 0973.
What's my number out? George Frank King, 6092. 455 shows out substation for a minute.
First person in 40 feet on Mystic Star.
How long has it been sent in JJ, please?
Mystic Star for case number 0011.
4 minutes.
Out of 410-4.
Yeah, I convicted.
The Jared Fernandez? Hispanic male, dark clothing, glassing on brown light, took about 75 packs of cigarettes.
Up 410 in the air. Go try pulling a trailer. Get onto the freeway, the access road. Alteration travel this time.
390 Bar Parkway, 3906 Bar Parkway. Copy, declining contact.
Wait.
There's a white passenger car parked in front of our house.
Pulling a trailer. Took up a Charlie 10-4.
That's in Hispanic male, goatee, black hoodie, black pants with a backpack. He has white writing on the front.
Pretty white writing.
Mendoza, 917 Mendoza.
If you want a unit, you can contact the key holder, have him come over there and verify that there's an employee or something. You're up front.
Joshua Quintana. Wearing no shirt, shorts, and black shoes.
You need someone else over there?
Get your feet.
You need one of us over there?
Is there any senator in the chamber who wishes to vote or change his or her vote? Seeing none. The yeas are 98, the nays are 0. The resolution is agreed to.
Case number is 160016.
Senator from Maryland.
I would ask consent that the Senate be in a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I'm proud of the advancements that we've made in health care in this country. Advancements that have been made, including those included in the Affordable Care Act. At lunch today, we had an opportunity to see one of the faces of the progress that we've made. Elena Hung brought her daughter to our caucus lunch today, and we had a chance to see how a young girl has been able to literally survive as a result of the coverage provided under our health care system. Since the passage of the Affordable Care Act, we have found more and more Americans have not only been able to get health insurance, but they've been able to get quality health insurance that covers their essential health benefits and provides them protection against discriminatory insurance company practices. We are clearly moving to where health care is a right, not a privilege. I say that fully aware that President Trump's policies have reversed some of this progress, and he's trying to reverse even more of this progress. The President's policies have sabotaged the individual marketplace. As a result, we see significant premium increases caused by action taken by the Trump administration in eliminating the individual responsibility, in not providing the cost sharing, in making it difficult for reinsurance to take place. All those add to the instability within the individual marketplace, turning it into more of a high-risk pool, increasing the premiums, and causing a lot of insurance companies to wonder whether they should be in that market at all. But recently, the Trump administration went one step further, which I would hope all Americans would be very much outraged. And that is the protection against pre-existing conditions that were included in insurance policies prior to the adoption of the Affordable Care Act. Pre-existing conditions, most of us have some form of pre-existing condition. You may have high blood pressure, high cholesterol, asthma, heart condition, diabetes. You may have had cancer. You maybe have behavioral health issues. All those are pre-existing conditions. According to a recent study by Health and Human Services, there is as many as 133 million Americans, non-elderly, that would qualify for pre-existing conditions and would be subject to discriminatory actions by private insurance companies if the protections under the Affordable Care Act were to vanish. In my own state of Maryland, that number is about 2.5 million Marylanders, non-elderly, that could be subject to discriminatory practices by insurance companies, 320,000 of whom are children. In June 2018, President Trump's administration broke a long-standing tradition and practice in this country and announced that it would not defend the court challenge to the Affordable Care Act. In the case of Texas versus the United States, not only did the Trump administration say that they would not intervene to protect the constitutionality of the act passed by Congress, but that they would submit a brief to the court recommending that protections such as the pre-existing condition protections that we have under existing law should be held invalid. Well, Mr. President, the Trump administration is going to the courts asking them to allow insurance companies to once again discriminate against people in this country based upon pre-existing conditions. That's why we have insurance, to protect you for what you need. Now, this is now in the courts, so we'll see what Texas versus U.S., what happens in that court, but it could very well end up in the Supreme Court of the United States. It's very clear that as we evaluate our judicial appointments, we need to understand the importance of the decisions that they will be called on to make. We had a circuit court appointment this afternoon that we were supposed to vote on. It's been withdrawn. I'm pleased about that, because that individual, I think, would not have been sensitive to the rights of the people of our country. And now we have a nominee for the Supreme Court of the United States, Judge Brett Kavanaugh. It is critically important that we understand that the Supreme Court of the United States may very well be considering the case of Texas versus the United States. They may very well be considering whether pre-existing condition restrictions that currently exist in law are valid or not. I think what we should be doing in our evaluation of President Trump's nominee is to determine whether that person will be an independent voice on the Supreme Court of the United States, representing the people of this country, protecting their constitutional rights against the abuses of power, whether that power comes from the White House or Capitol Hill or corporate America. In health, and there's so many areas that we should be concerned about. Today I'm going to talk on health care. Yes, it is very possible that this particular nominee, if confirmed, could be a deciding vote on pre-existing condition restrictions. Judge Kavanaugh dealt with the Affordable Care Act in 2011 on the D.C. Circuit, where there was a challenge to the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act. The court did not hold it invalid, but Judge Kavanaugh was in the dissent on that opinion, raising concerns to us as to whether he'll side with consumers or special interests as it relates to protecting consumers and policyholders in this country against the abusive practices of health insurance companies. We also, of course, have the concern of whether women's health care issues, women's right of choice will be protected. Roe v. Wade. Judge Kavanaugh has raised questions as to whether he will follow precedent. Now, Roe v. Wade is well established, but I have little comfort as to whether Judge Kavanaugh, in fact, will follow that precedent. These are issues that as we start the vetting process, our interviews and our committee hearings, that really we need to drill down and understand where Judge Kavanaugh is on these issues. And then I bring up the high cost of prescription drugs. One of the basic protections I would hope our court would do is to protect consumers against powerful special interests. We have to make sure as we vet Judge Kavanaugh as to whether he'll side with the people of this country or with the powerful special interests. Now, we have a greater role than just vetting the next Supreme Court nominee. There are things that we can do to protect our health care system. I've talked to many of my colleagues, and many have said on both sides of the aisle, we want to protect against the pre-existing condition restrictions in insurance policies. So why don't we take action? Let us make sure that we protect the Affordable Care Act as it relates to denying insurance companies the ability to deny you coverage based upon pre-existing conditions. We could also intervene in the lawsuit that is pending to tell the courts we meant what we said. Insurance companies cannot impose pre-existing restrictions on coverage. And yes, we should deal with the high cost of prescription drugs. There's things that we can do. We've had suggestions on both sides of the aisle. The president talked about this during his campaign, but it's done little to deal with the cost of prescription drugs. One of the basic things you can do, Economics 101, use the collective purchasing power of the government, larger market share, to bring down costs. Why are we paying 2 and 3 times what consumers in industrial nations in the world are paying for the same drugs? Let us organize our market so that our consumers can get better price. We can pass legislation to make that a reality. And then, yes, we should take the necessary time in the process of considering President Trump's nominations to the court, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States, to make sure that we recognize that the balance of the court is at stake. Let us make sure that we use as our barometer whether Judge Kavanaugh will represent your constitutional rights over the powerful, over the abuses of any president, Congress, or corporate America. We don't want a rubber stamp for President Trump, particularly in these times when we have the sensitive Mueller investigation going on, when we have the president taking so much power. We want to make sure that we saw what he did on the borders, what he's doing in so many ways, violating the basic values of this country. We want to make sure that there is an independent court that won't be beholden to the President of the United States. We need to protect the advancements that we've made in health care, including the protections against pre-existing conditions, women's right of choice, and to continue to work on the high cost of health care. With that, Mr. President, I would suggest the absence of the call.
And the clerk should call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
I'm sorry, you have people staging?
Yeah, there's some property down there, some sort of property at the very end of 49A in the past. It's off of Old Brownsville Road, just south of Saratoga.
Yeah, I'm actually here at Saratoga and Old Brownsville. I'll head over there and check it out.
Yeah, it's very, very last house in the corner by the dump.
Okay, 49A is, when you're going south, you're going to take a left or a right, or is it only a right?
Alarm.
420, copy. 420, 410, I'll hit that way as well.
4.074.
Just Adam in think we had Old Brownsville County 4A looking around for this reference to stolen tractor.
10-4. I'll be en route, coming from Grisham. 10-4.
Last thought connectivity is back.
And now I got two.
You really only have one. One of them's mine.
What is that?
3 X-ray boy 8344.
For maintenance. Show us back in service in quarters.
450 in town here.
Show me how that means for a minute.
Another call from a key holder. They're advising that the subject has permission
White Chevy Tahoe. That's straight Henry Boy X-ray. Correction. Henry Boy Henry 1136. Vehicle is swerving. Driving reckless. But a ball has been on the causeway. Patrol 4219.
Yeah. You said 420 was coming here, right?
Coming from Leopard Ballin.
Okay.
Got a signal 25 there on Cottonwood coming to the shop. 25 there on Cottonwood coming to the shop.
Make contact with a bartender named Liberty.
Got a tip that they sell a bunch of tractors on that end. That's the very last house, something on 49A. Go there and see if the tractors are.
5 to 6 subjects that are fighting outside on our weapons. They are intoxicated. Female and a female.
410 Charlie 440 for disturbance. SPID airs. SPID airs.
Charlie 3.
Colorado pickup. Other vehicles will be Black Mazda 6.
So one more from the Coleman, commitment to Doctor's Regional.
Phoenix, the pumps, I didn't bring mine today. Before Bradley and Agnes.
Be advised, the vehicles are going to be turning around. Our be advised, they're going to be headed back towards the Mission Shopping Center.
They're coming up airs towards Gullah Harbor because I'm in that area.
Before they were last approaching Horn, then the RP stated that they made it. They were turning around, headed back toward Mission. The other vehicle turned around as well.
For disturbance in progress.
The vehicle, Blackwell Horn.
3901 Southport
Black
Avenue.
Mazda 6 and a white Colorado.
Okay, they just went through the intersection. I'm on airs now coming up behind them.
410, 440 copy.
410, 4. How many vehicles involved here? I got 2 trucks going down the highway in the car.
It'd be a white Chevy Colorado pickup and a black Mazda 6 for the 2 vehicles involved.
I got the black Mazda 6 in front of me. He's got a paper tag. 19566 North 7.
240, 10-4.
Again, I'll give you a call back here in a bit. Across from Estella.
4 in front of Estella's.
306, I am out on 49A. The individual came from. Well, it's right across the street from me.
2410-4.
William 3452.
Charlie 474, suspicious activity.
2410, that's Colorado, please. George Young Frank, 1610.
Red pickup, the Dodge, indicating that she had photos on her
Prince 3 vehicles parked in front of the vacant house.
that
Black
shows
and
this
gray
guy
passenger
setting
cars.
this trash can on fire at her house. On the right, and then there's like a trailer behind it.
Right now,
that road.
She wants to cancel, but...
That's it's right on the corner there. Right loop to your left, it goes back to Saratoga.
Okay, alright, thank you.
Hey, yeah, I don't see anything out here. Alright, Temple. Disappeared pretty quick, that's why I figured it might be there.
24 is... Okay.
With the title, thank you. Let's see your mobile. Yeah.
Okay, so this Kubota guy over here at the business does not know how to work the camera system. He will have somebody come in at 8 that can probably burn a DVD for it. He still does not have any idea what was taken, so I'm just going to get a case number, and then after they figure it out, I guess they can just call back.
They knocked the fence down?
It's a little cheesy, it's just a real light panel to secure some of these tractors from the front there in the front. They removed that piece, and then they went into the business and using a grinder to cut a bigger, thicker type swing gate to get into the yard.
Pass for right now. Then they can always add the trailer later. Active. 306, you can clear 306, 311. Thank you, County Unit. Appreciate your help.
4970. Runway driver, suspect vehicles, a silver passenger car going.
Middle name is Arthur. Adam Robert.
Next level, hoping that it is. The male driver.
White male, date of birth is 21.
I'm not going to have the accident now.
Make 22192, 10-4.
380, 10-4, Delta 320, clear.
Sorry, for time, but 6
2970, 10-4, probably related to the one in
last name is first name is Jimmy, spelling is John Ida, Mary, Ida, Edward. Middle name is Lee, spelling is Lincoln, Edward, Jr. Give me a black belt, date of birth is 4/19. Give me the hit and run.
330, 41999, related to the runway driver that the unit turned out to.
Jimmy Williams is negative 29, TCIC and CIC.
Channel 4, thank you.
11 and 10-4, another hour or so.
The data's in service in quarters.
Copy,
thank you.
She'll be in the parking lot of American Bank Center.
Okay. And show me a flag down over here at Blue Jay and Quetzal reference. Kids throwing rocks at cars.
Blue Jay and Quetzal, Bravo 466, you're out to back up.
427, reference the accident that you went out on earlier. DPS is handling it, but did you happen to get a name for the driver? We have off duty at Bay Area that's trying to get some information. 45. Maybe the Jeffrey Gutierrez, I called DPS dispatch, and that's all they had.
Bars of them, there is a clear also. I'll clear them up.
Yes, but let me get back with you on that one. Let me call the other
14 Greenwood, calling.
I'm clear. Show me out on a vehicle, 825 Quetzal. Ready for plate. Can I have the return on that? Address on? 47. Dale, 545 Oakdale on that gray Toyota Camry.
Henry Robert, David 6473.
Port Henry Robert, David 6473. Cool.
On Monday, we went to that assault call with that yellow truck, and you got that information from one of the witnesses, Emily Rios. Do you have her information so you can text and send to me?
He advised that
her phone number and
DPS
stuff?
took over the accident, and they hadn't had a case number on it yet. They gave me one name, but they weren't sure if that was the driver. I'm talking with the fire dispatcher right now, and they believe that one of the battalion chiefs didn't have a name, the driver. But the constable is going to give his other officer a call.
Show me signal 4. 345. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your help.
The 420, I'll show you now to back him up. Be for airport.
Alright, take your pillow out. Text out, headed your way with the paperwork.
Adam Charles, Ida Ocean. He's going to be a junior. 619 and 76.
Down Barton Oak, 3210. Down Barton Oak, over just one call. Alright, they heard the neighbors arguing.
Edward,
4 shots.
Sam.
Heard a vehicle drive off. No description
Adam,
so far.
Charles, Ida, Ocean.
Call spinning patrol for 217.
Gonna be a junior.
Or Estacio, Cantu Junior, 61976.
All right.
Sample.
50. I'll be out at apartment 1, 25 quick. Number 1, reference. Where's this car? Apartment 1. Disturbance 3535 Cottonwood, Southern Comfort Apartments, apartment Charlie 2.
Charlie 410, I'm going to clear this part. And I'll be en route to that. Call
Ready, case number 17-0017.
With the people in the black vehicle. Copy.
Charlie 340.
Well, you can assist the Delta units. Send the call to your MDT. Switch over patrol 2. Yeah, 420. Address on Valhalla is going to be 3526. We're in service at the station.
Lincoln Ocean. First name is going to be Charles, Young, Nora, Tom, Henry, Ida, Adam, 727.
Estacio Castillo, 727. What was the year your radio broke up?
8407.
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
The name for the driver is going to be Jeffrey.
Report coming 72760.
And I have his 27. I have the number. I'm going to run it so I can get a date of birth.
Eligible expires in 2023, 51155, black over brown.
Can I get you Airport 52?
No, not yet. I'm about to go to the end right now.
Fully outside it.
Hey, do you want the plate for your call for this car?
Perfect. Yeah,
She just had it added to my call as well.
Alright.
Cottonwood. 3605 Cottonwood.
Robert 6694. John Nora Robert 6694.
Tell the 464.
Charlie 430 shaker.
60 clear.
Don't need me up here.
Sure, you're back on. Date of birth, 1972, on Gilliam. That's going to be out of 4.
Mercado on the backside of Mall.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Charlie 470, 10-4.
Adam 3-4, check. California Airlines, 440 WK. 10-4. 410-10-4. Clear 7, patient around at Port Industrial.
One suspicious subject in Ormond and SF on Gulf Breeze.
Next door to flow serve? Yeah, do that now. Yes, ma'am. One subject, please. Last name Rodriguez. Robert Ocean. First name is Benjamin, spelling it boy, Edward Nora, John Adam Mary Ida Nora. His date of birth is 8/6/1982.
Rodriguez 8682, 10-4.
Turning clear. Sub 370 through 80 for suspicious subjects, 1555 Ormond. Airfield decline contact.
Video check.
Nothing clear.
24651 clear. Okay.
Calling for the sister.
Clear.
Clear.
Student apartment number 711. Make contact with the Robert Minera.
All behind me, your top light is out.
Northwest 121 shoreline at the Whataburger. It's going to be a Jonathan, but I'm requesting contact the manager. To maintain financial responsibility, on a white shirt and black pajamas, banging on the windows asking for food. 27 shows. Should be in the museum of the site of the art museum. 22.
440 there.
40 total.
Clear. 10-4, thank you.
Charles Robert Young, Sam Tom Adam Lincoln, 9583.
Calling Central going down.
Repeat the first name.
Charles Robert Young, Sam Tom Adam Lincoln.
So it is Friendship, right?
Bush, but it's still Friendship in the map book.
Your license, being in a school zone, no driver's license.
Right there by the
to maintain financial responsibility. 27 is eligible. ID card expires 21.
10-4, thank you.
$828 of 87.
Mason 828-87, 10-4. NCIC, showing 2 possibles for 27. Is your radio secure? 898. NC bench warrant for assault.
Charlie 470 to the ID unit. Go to mobile. 10-4. You can go ahead and dispatch that now. 1. 442. Robert 50. Copy plate real quick. It's going to be the new plate that's on that vehicle. It's going to be George Victor William 3237.
Leon 3237 double.
Do you see that's I saw the repo third coast in here earlier. Do you see if we got repo please? Or you want to go to info?
Roger. That's picked up by Lone Star.
Okay, Lone Star ticket? Okay.
Sorry, say again.
Thank you.
I can actually hear him pretty clear.
980, 99, 99.
410, I'm clear.
I'm going to say probably in the area of Kingston Apartment, at least that one. But it could have been at that intersection of Staples and McCarter also. Sound like Crystal Callaway.
Maybe that's the temporary stop sign is by public clear.
X-ray Nora 5428, the gray van.
Yeah, it's going to be related.
10-4, 3500, Greenwood, Georgia, X-ray Nora 5428.
410. Christian Bravo 420, 10. Parking lot out here.
Next moment.
You get some better rooms there, Hennessy.
Road racer rim.
Out of Harris County for larceny. And it's showing 2 possibles for 27.
Last name Reed. Clear, I'm with 440 and I'll take 410 to after that. Charlie 410, straight clear. Charlie 410, 2-4. Thank you. 4720 clear.
Number 22, to location to Brazos and Ryan.
Brazos and Brick.
460, confirm straight up, 450, 460, for suicide draft at 323 Pueblo. Keep the flight, contact is Johnny. Phone number of South of Edmonton, wants to harm himself, black shirt, black sleeping pants. He has a pocket knife, but hasn't displayed it.
For 27.
ordinate. It's going to be 27 is eligible, ID card expired 17. 4653 Franklin.
RPD on contact.
For any possession history?
42-4. Above 460, I can advise you can go ahead and cancel 80. Another forwarding, stay clear.
1306. Kill me a service, I'll be in charge. 3150 working Stone Garden until about noon.
Delta 450 clear traffic.
Clear.
The generator in the back. I think the one Pete was talking about on the island was like a employee of the truck or something. Unless these are the same two, I don't know.
I'm not sure about the trailer. This is the one Pete was talking about though. I looked up 49 also.
K940?
There's some more stuff in the report.
Start of the plate.
Sure, can you be requested to a traffic stop Mansheimer Eastern?
Checking for possible stolen vehicle at the Padre Motel.
Okay, 10-4. Yeah, that's the suspect from the 58 at 10-4.
Come on, show me the area. 735.
735.
We'll be out at apartment 2301 after Heights 1.
So stable. RP is also declining contact. Charlie 430 action around to their locations. Could be Buffalo Wild Wings.
Brendo 52476 10-4.
He says the 29 vehicles at Walmart. We're going to be headed over there right now.
The vehicle is at Walmart.
And he has the truck key in his shoe. And he said the guy let him borrow it. And he wants me to call him and straighten it out. So are you
Okay, 14-4.
230.
10-4, the guy that owns the truck, he was gone, and I guess Mr. Grove there went to his house, and because he keeps the key stored inside the vehicle, and took the key and took the vehicle, which had a trailer, and the vehicle owner found the trailer ditched on Castoris with all the gear still on it, and then so he's been looking for his truck. He got his trailer back, and no idea why he ditched the trailer, probably because it was too much to haul around.
Okay.
Got the trailer, and you might want to make sure that the generator's still in it. He might have sold it, but he's got history of using people's identifications. I also put that in the report. He had 2 different identifications in his wallet. I tagged that as evidence as well.
Okay. You found his wallet in the truck?
Wallet was in the trailer. When the victim found the trailer, he went through it. He's looking through all this stuff to make sure it was all there, and he found his wallet stashed in some sort of compartment there.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I meant trailer, not truck. Okay. He's saying he lives with that guy.
Hey, LT, are you back here?
Hold on a minute.
Oh, God. He's an old man.
You're coming in with,
he's married, and his wife is disabled.
Alright,
the generator in the truck, or
I'm not sure if you're updated yet. So,
on the truck.
No serious injuries. He had some head injuries, but medics cleared up.
It's supposed to be like a $4,500 generator, Black & Decker brand.
And he was asked to leave earlier by security, trying to come back, flailing his arms, being aggressive, and I guess on the way out it looks like he tripped as they were escorting him. It didn't look like anybody pushed him 10-4. And I also have video of it, and I recorded it, so I was thinking of doing a case number for an injured party just to cover ourselves. He said he's going to take a cab home. 10-4.
Hey, did you want to contact the victim and see if he wants to come pick it up?
David William Tom 8435. Good area.
First name is Charles.
I wonder how the vehicle owner came up with the Roger Motel for him to call it in.
Yeah, I was wondering that too. Not on the call. The info's there, but yeah, it didn't say how he figured that out. He said he'd been trying to call him. I don't know how true that is. Maybe it was.
He did not get information to get rid of that generator. The generator was wired down in the bed of that truck.
Oh, really?
That's what he uses to power all his equipment. It's a mobile car wash business that he does. And the car wash does pressure washer, tank, and all the pump is all still on the trailer. But the trailer was ditched onto storage.
All around last name Victor, Ida, Mickey, Adam, Sam, Edward, Nora, Ocean, Robert, first name John, 630
Cut it or something, I don't know.
I don't know how to secure. Maybe he just had some bungees. I mean, he didn't secure it to the bed because, I mean, there's no holes.
Need any more impounds out here?
Or any aftermarket rigging.
Airport 1015 clear.
Westbound, right before Costores. Counting.
10-4.
King Victor Tom,
Thank you, 904 clear. If I have an individual, please. Hard times and King Victor Tom, 0.
Charlie 410 and Charlie 420 for a stalled vehicle, 358 westbound at Costores, 358 westbound at Costores.
5813 arriving.
Charlie 420.
Charlie 310, Charlie 3.
Charlie 470.
10-4.
470.
Picking up my part, and if you could put me on Bravo 416's call, and I'm headed to 4927 Curtis Clark, reference their call.
Good ball. She fell down.
Yeah, she was walking down the steps to throw out the trash, and there's some
10-4, ma'am. Thank you much. 1002 clear.
walkway. She just slipped, twisted her ankle.
Delta 44, show me, sir.
Swelling to her right ankle. Go back here.
Block off the outside lane, please.
You want an injured party or anything?
Charlie 420, copy.
Negative 10-4.
One.
I don't know.
Drivable?
Yeah. Just a beauty to me.
Hey, hang on. Supposed to be out of gas, but drivable.
Go ahead, partner.
236.
Pushing him off?
Negative, they're driving off themselves. They're trying to get off of the freeway and the axis.
There's a 420 record, right?
I'm going to clear up the freeway then. Yeah, 10-4. I appreciate it.
Travel fatigue.
904, 10-4.
Alright, 10-4. 10 service.
Ready. Just FYI though, we contact kicking back as high risk and contact the shelter, but sure refuse everything. 10-4, I'll put that in a report.
430, Yo Mobile.
460.
Looking for Andy Lopez. This is Charlie 470. I'm gonna take him over there to pick up the vehicle. He says that generator was secured with some cables in the bed of the truck so it wouldn't move. And so I guess, you know, I guess the generator got sold or something.
Yeah, Josh is here. He's got the guy, the suspect, plugged up in his car. I'm gonna go take a around the motel 6.
That's 460 for
Right when you pull in off the freeway, we got first stop.
Southgate, 1416 Southgate. The vacant apartment there by the Hispanic female.
Okay. Yeah, so it's just a Walmart and he's got the key, right? So he can take it from there?
Sorry, what's that?
So he's got y'all got the key for the truck so he could just pick it up from there?
Yeah, his claim is that it's out of gas, but it did turn on, so I don't know if it is low, how far he'll get, but Josh said it turned on.
Okay, I'll tell the owner. He said that He'd been calling around looking for that guy all day, and I guess he received a call in the middle of the night from some girl saying that where to find him. Some girl was pretty mad at this dude, Mr. Grove, called the vehicle owner over here and told him where to find that guy. Yeah, it's at 4. So we're gonna jump in that unit. And I'm gonna take him over there. Okay. 400.
100 block sponsor.
One to Agnes and Plutzer.
Sponsor talk.
38834.
7 John 338834.
On his eye, and we heard shots on the area right now.
Dennis Berlanga at 7014 SPID.
That's the only injury?
Nicole is negative 29 as well. Minute 2016 Cove.
That's gonna be it.
Charlie 220.
Hey, I'm listening. Hey, it's gonna be a Black & Decker brand. It's gonna be black and red.
Do you have like a size rating or anything like that, or number?
4 Curtis Street, 3614 Curtis, cross street with Virginia and Post. 35-year-old. Vomiting, talking, call updating. Work on fire dispatch at 532.
Lincoln Ocean Robert. Date of birth.
Yeah, he says all he knows is it's a huge one. He's not sure the like engine size or anything.
650 transit radio check.
LT, don't approve that red sheet. Can you, if you haven't approved it, can you take it back?
With narrative.
Charlie 410 rep.
Yeah, I gotta change something real quick.
Fort Dodge Ram 1500 color. Recovered at 1254 Bluff Drive.
Just missed a couple of wordings in there, so I gotta change. I'm gonna be out with a couple subjects here at Mary and 20th.
Mary and 20, Delta 440, Delta 420, copy.
Loud and clear.
Thank you, dispatch 1003 clear.
We'll clear 5 at rest. What do you need us?
I'm sure you're not with the other units today, but
Fajitaville, 221 Public Health for PSI
Delta 46 always subjects up,
2 hours.
Mary and 20.
The male was intoxicated in a dark gray 4x4 Chevy truck.
They report wrecking Victor Floyd in Norton on that accident from earlier. In Norton on that accident from earlier.
217 North Clockwest. Will be room 433, number 433. The
217 Southeast 29 only.
difficulty breathing, more coffee and less water. 241.
Your first?
First one, last name's Fallon. Frank Edward Lincoln Adam Nora. First name Roman. 227 of 03. White male. 726 of 01. White male.
I'll be out at
It
301.
was 2 or 3, 2011. Negative 29 with that one, with the 2, 27 of 03. I wasn't getting, there's no return. We do have history with one for 3, 27 of 03.
With 3, 27, is that one? So, negative 29.
Still negative.
4, thank you.
10 clear.
40.
In contact with the homeowner.
Be clear on subjects that I'm still be on the call.
652 radio check.
5306 Pheasant Circle, 5306 Pheasant Circle, cross street with Hund. 59-year-old male, cancer patient, conscious and breathing, also updating. Fire dispatch at 545. 4614 Donegal, cross street with Kilmert. Updating. Fire dispatch at 545. Alright,
1022 clear. 1014 to 7373. Waiting for the take Armand Bay.
For a stroke, victim 4614 Donegal, 4614 Donegal, going to be a 92-year-old female, conscious and breathing, not responding very well, vomited, laying face down. Possible stroke for EMS 1547.
Engine 6 responding. 1110. Show me in service, please. Service.
Squad 4 will be in service returning. I think Michael. Date of birth is going to be 19 of 82. It's going to be black male. Also, can you see if he has a criminal trespass for the YMCA?
That was listed on the line. Michael Leach, return 1982, 10-4.
That's the adult male to the area of somewhere off the airline. We're going to be going north on.
Turn out for runaway. Elgin and Baldwin has been pending for an hour and a half. An hour and 15 minutes. Contact is Jesus.
North of the corner, there's no item. Delta 435 right.
Negative for the CTW. Yes, that corner.
Yeah, 4.
2032.
And Delta 460, can you go ahead and fax those MCs over to CDC, please?
RD 2032.
Charlie, what's that? Alright, management said they already left. Nobody was hurt. You can 18 everybody. I'll be clear.
Fort Charlie 379, Charlie 450, should we clear?
Yes, sir. The key holder arrived. We're going to the door. We'll be clear for that.
Charlie 375, 10-4.
I'm at Agnes and Brownlee.
446, copy. Alert. T97 transit radio check.
No need for a fight in progress. 4650 Castorius of the Midway Club. 4650 Castorius of the Midway Club. Repeat declining contact, saying there's 15 people out there.
130, 37.
30, careful.
Had a TJ Castorius. I'll be out with 46. 410 arriving, service. 21, 10-4, thank you.
Out and clear. Wait for a minute. So 460, turn 4, out at me.
1-5.
Quick in for copy.
I'm at airline SPD. I had that gentleman wait. He's gonna come over to Gulfway and wait here for us in case we find it.
3 teenagers from age 15 to 17. They took his phone. He did have injuries. He did not want us to take pictures, but he just told us those were 3 teenagers, 15 to 17 years old.
Where's some 358?
He said they left on foot, going north on Blunter, but when we checked the area, we didn't see anything.
Okay.
Case number?
Alright, I'm having problems with my intergraph. I don't know if anybody else is or not.
That's 435. He's not declining contact, but said the vehicle is still there. Yeah.
Show me on service, 236. Looks like we're going to go to Wilder Rock. ETA on record, please. Up there. Yeah, I agree. Not before we arrive.
150 in the area.
30.
Alright, yeah, you couldn't give us a location. I want to be clear on part.
Very clear.
Well, 470 Buzzy, sorry. 21. 21, Peggy.
21.
Yeah, he said he's going to run 10, 15 minutes late so he can start the meter after the appointed time.
Okay.
10.
Yes, ma'am. Code 1, spawn south, 0.1.
Returning.
Charlie, 20, I'm clear.
66 Young, 1672.
196.
Suspicious vehicle, McCordical stores. McCordical stores. RPD line contact. Transporting code 1 to spawn shoreline. Beginning knowledge your plan.
Sorry, 420, 10-4.
You're with static. What did you say? Can you repeat?
One adult male detained. My unit reference call.
608. Now 420 advised and out to the sub.
I'll just go for station for them.
Step out. There's several apartments out here.
Shoreline beginning mileage 0.1. Boy William Tom, 4305.
William Tom 4305.
I don't know, everything seems to be okay. It's just it's a little rough noise in the back of the bus. I don't know if maintenance can meet him somewhere or you want him to continue?
Maintenance is going to meet up with them. Yes, have them continue.
Okay, 10-4.
Taco Bell.
Complaining nausea and vomiting for the last 24 hours. About every hour on the hour.
802 North Omaha.
Currently, patient Dano times 4 with a vitals as follows. Blood pressure 160 over 106, pulse of 117, 96% on room air, temperature of 101.7, blood sugar of 160. Got an IV established, still friend on board. We'll be at your facility in about 5 minutes.
16 spawn south clear. Assignment and arrival. Thanks.
Next, you can be on for a minor to be 5606. I'm manifest 5306 voltage, 5306 voltage.
Roger.
I'll try.
No, 55. Alright, I'll just give you a phone number. Find that other one.
He told the kid when he punched him in the face, I forgot that I saw it on the cam. 10-4. Okay, man. Alright, I'll go back and read that.
CDC. Oh, okay. Is this LT? This is Clark? My bad. I was looking for LT, Bravo 4.
All servants, it's your call.
Alright, Charles 1150, 10-4.
Mobile 4 on patrol 4. He's been trying to raise you. Can you go to mobile 4?
That apartment, I'm sorry. Right, just checking. Till what time we're going to be out there? I show here it was going to be till 2
I guess we're going to have this 12. We're going to have a Bravo 1 unit. Take him all there. It's just a warrant. It's just the warrant. That's all it is. Just to write up a warrant and transport him to the city.
Alright, 10-4, let me get with Danny. He's out here loading his truck.
Alright, 10-4. I mean, Feather has him. I mean, if you want him to take him, but I think it'd be advantageous for one to take him.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll see. Let me catch him real quick.
Warren 4, RE58. Can you put me signal 4 4301 Yolanda?
He wanted. What is the warrant?
301 Yolanda 10-4. You needed a lead?
ALT, yeah, the marshal's in a house 424 Lakeside over here with family violence. It's continuous sexual assault of a child. Of the day.
Your Feather. I don't want to have one of y'all stay. I'd rather just knock it out real quick, whoever's there. Have Bravo
5306.
Well, have them fill it out, hand off the prisoner, and while they're en route over there, have them type out the arrest sheet, and then just knock out the 5-8. It's a simple one. It's just assisted them on the roundup and he was contacted, identified, warrant was good, and booked him.
10-4, that was our plan.
Well, we have internet problems. Any units have problems with it?
International Drive.
Acknowledge.
OB for flames in the back of a tractor trailer. Back of a semi-on fly. We're called for fire dispatch at 622.
Vehicle fired 44 and McKenzie, 44 eastbound and McKenzie. I think it's going to be at the turnaround. Looks like the back of a semi that's on fire. Near the, supposed to be on 44 near the grain elevator.
Engine 9, it's going to be at McKenzie and Highway 44, so it's going to be OCL. Annabelle Fire Department. Annabelle Fire Department for vehicle fire outside structure, Highway 44 in McKenzie, Highway 44 in McKenzie, for flames in the back of a trailer, tractor trailer. Anyone, 10-4.
Engine 71, you advise switch to group 10.
Anyone advise group 10, 10-4.
Copy.
In OCO, it's going to be Highway 44 in McKenzie, so we've got Annabelle and that.
Pretty much frozen.
It's going to be engine 71 that responds since it's going to be OCO. Oh, it's just the OCO, so I'll show you guys. 614.
1, ma'am.
Being sponsor only under mileage, tempo 1, 10-4.
Back here.
10-4 clear.
10-4. Just getting gas at, I just left 546, but getting gas at the gas station. I'm gonna roll up on here, so I'll let you okay, 10-4. Make your way over here when you're done. Just get the traffic control. Yeah, I'm heading that way. Transport. 10-4. Tom 649125.
JM.
Sure you'll make it on time. Route 12. Well, when you get to the shop, drop it off. He already knows you're coming. And you're going to take 2006. He's repairing it for you.
Nissan 10 Shaft 2006. Oh, I had it.
Let me dispatch. When you get to the shop, take 2006 if it's ready. If not, call me back. All units clear the air now.
Oh, I got it.
Put you in a private. I will. Give me like 2 minutes. I got 2 drivers and I will put you in a private, sir.
1022, base. 1022. I was going out before I went outbound, but it's okay. 1022.
Baldwin exit, Henry Tom, Nora 9907.
Northbound Baldwin, 10-4.
Couple lacerations to the face.
Charlie 440 to Charlie 410, 20, 30, 55, 60, and 70.
B as in boy, E-H, M-A-N-N, for 7, Ayala.
Another 440, we're going to be taking
Number 24, he's going to 4421 Agnes, the lighthouse.
Yeah, 10-4.
You had a 547 ready time.
Okay, I got it.
The one is 1305 Harbor Village. I just want you to pass by there and see if he's ready. See if he's still there. 1305 Harbor Village for Harold Grove, going to the lighthouse.
No arrest or anything.
Man down. Chewy 5933 S80 5933 S80. Intoxicated female
Senator
driving
from
a
Ohio.
silver Ford Focus.
Mr. President, today will be the quorum call.
The Senate is in a quorum call.
I ask unanimous consent to initiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
130, that's the correct call.
Mr. President, today I'd like to report back to my colleagues here in the Senate and to the American people about the results of legislation we passed here in the United States Senate and the House was signed into law by the President. We don't do that often enough. You know, we tend to pass legislation and don't do the oversight to figure out whether it's working or not. In this case, this was legislation we passed on a bipartisan basis called the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act. We passed it back in April. This is legislation that allows the victims of sex trafficking to get the justice they deserve by being able to sue websites that traffic them online knowingly and to be able to have some accountability for these horrible crimes that are committed online. And then also to allow prosecutors at the state and local level to be able to prosecute these cases. We drafted the legislation because after looking at this for several years, realized that there was a rise in trafficking going on, trafficking of girls, underage, trafficking of women, sometimes boys, underage, and that this was increasing primarily because of the internet, kind of the dark side of the internet. You know, we're hearing a lot about what's going on in the internet these days in terms of meddling in our elections and so on. Of all the positives on the internet, there's also a darker side, and we realized that this was happening online increasingly and that it was a ruthlessly efficient way to basically sell people online. So we looked at it and found out that there was a federal law that was put in place with good intentions, I believe, back a couple of decades ago to try to ensure freedom of the internet, which of course all of us support, but it provided an effective immunity to these websites, even if they were selling people online knowingly. So we wrote legislation to get at that, spent about a year trying to get that through the process and eventually got it to a vote and got it passed. The law which provided the immunity was part of the Communications Decency Act that was meant, again, to try to encourage freedom of the internet, but was taken too far, particularly in how it was interpreted by the courts. The internet was something that we had to address because without that you would see this increase of drug trafficking and sex trafficking. So what happened? Well, after passing the law, there was a pretty dramatic change. On Monday, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio, my hometown, at a place called the Change Court. The Change Court is a place where women who are incarcerated, who are trafficked and incarcerated for prostitution, are able to go through a 2-year program to help them get clean, and if they're willing to go through this program, to let them walk away with a clean record. Understanding that sex trafficking is not a crime, that in effect they are victims of trafficking. And it's very inspiring to go there because in that case I talked to about a dozen women who are currently in the program, some women who had graduated from the program, and the stories are unbelievable of women getting their lives back together, getting back to work, getting back to their families, in almost every case getting back to their children, because almost every case these are moms, and having the self-respect and dignity that comes with work and getting back with their families and getting their lives back on track. It's really a much, much better alternative than the system of throwing people into jail who are in effect victims of this trafficking and not dealing with their issues, whether it's the trauma or whether it's the drug addiction, which in almost every case of these women, there was a drug addiction issue. Almost all of them were opiate addicts or recovering addicts. One was addicted to alcohol, but this is just common. So anyway, in talking to these women, almost every one of them said the same thing, which is yes, they had been trafficked online. And they were very interested in this legislation because, look, they've been through it. And they want to save future women and girls from having to go down this dark path. So anyway, we passed the legislation, and the SESTA legislation meant to be able to help on this issue. And I was able to tell these women at the Change Court what the results were. And they're pretty dramatic. On Monday of this week, I also met with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, or NCMEC. That's the leading anti-trafficking group, really, in the country. They work day and night in trying to stop online sex trafficking. They keep track of it. They keep the statistics and the data. They particularly focus on, of course, rescuing kids from being exploited. According to NCMEC, the result since SESTA is signed into law has been swift and significant. NCMEC said, and I quote, "Since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage," that's Backpage.com, a website that was doing most of the commercial sex trafficking prior to our legislation. Since the enactment of SESTA and the government seizure of Backpage, there has been a major disruption in the online marketplace. The robust marketplace for sex trafficking, including the sale of children for rape and sexual abuse that took a decade to build, fragmented over the course of just a few days, end quote. They also said, and I quote, "Many sites or portions of sites where NCMEC knew children previously had been sold for sex have voluntarily shut down." Their bottom line, and I quote, "This means it is much harder to purchase a child online. This means it is much harder to purchase a child online." That's great news. And that's exactly what we intended this legislation to do, to be able to save these kids and these women and sometimes boys from being subject to this horrific crime. I will tell you there's another analysis that was shared with me recently. You can find this online. But this analysis found that online ads selling women and children have been reduced since our legislation passed by between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Between 60 and 80%, depending on the state. Dramatic change. And again, having the effect of saving literally thousands of children. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to be vigilant about this issue because, you know, when you push something down in one place, it often pops up somewhere else, doesn't it? But we have done an effective job at dealing with a very real problem. Backpage.com, which we talked about, was the industry leader. They have now been shut down. Their CEO and the company has pled guilty to numerous money laundering and trafficking-related charges. And because prosecutors can now do their work and go after these online traffickers, and because victims of this important crime can finally have their day in court, these websites that knowingly facilitate sex trafficking are being shut down and being held liable for their actions. By the way, this never would have been possible without the work of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. The staff there, the investigators, spent 2 years working on this issue, investigating it. We had to come all the way to this floor, to the chamber, in order to enforce our subpoenas, to get the information which we were able to unveil that no one else had been able to find, which showed clearly that they knew what they were doing. They knew they were selling underage kids online. So I'm very proud of those investigators. I chair that subcommittee. It's bipartisan, and they do good work, and they deserve to be applauded given the results that we're now seeing. And by the way, it's not just Backpage. A lot of other classified websites have also shut down their personal labs, so-called, or sex-related operations. The issue of sex trafficking, again, we've made good progress on, but it is so related to the issue of opioid abuse. And specifically, as I said, this goes hand in hand often. Often traffickers find people who are addicted because they are vulnerable, because they crave the drug and the trafficker can provide it. But also, many times we have found in my home state of Ohio, as I've met with survivors, that they find vulnerable people who are not addicted, but then make them addicted, so they become dependent on the trafficker. So this is an issue that relates to so many things, doesn't it? It relates to our workplace because people who are addicted to opioids are not coming into the workforce. One reason we have such high levels of unemployment, people outside the workforce altogether, they're not showing up on the unemployment numbers because they're not even looking for work. The labor force participation rate, as economists call it, is so low right now, is largely, in my view, because of this opioid issue. Our courts are jammed, our jails are jammed, our hospital emergency rooms are jammed. We have to do more to get at this issue for so many reasons. The driving force there, in my home state of Ohio, and around the country now, is this synthetic form of heroin or opioids. It's called fentanyl, 50 times more powerful than heroin. There's other drugs called carfentanil as an example, even more powerful. These drugs, these synthetic forms of opioids, are causing most of the deaths now in my state of Ohio and around the country. The Center for Disease Control, CDC, recently issued a report which showed this increase in overdose deaths involving fentanyl. The report analyzed overdose deaths in 10 states hit hardest by the epidemic, including Ohio. It found that fentanyl overdose deaths in those states nearly doubled from the last 6 months of 2016 to the first 6 months of 2017. They found that fentanyl overdose deaths in those states nearly doubled from the last 6 months of 2016 to the first 6 months of 2017. And of course, 2017 is the last year for which they have good records. It's unbelievable. This synthetic form of heroin is the new scourge of the opioid epidemic. And by the way, it's being spread into every other drug too. So when I do roundtables back home, as I do regularly, I hear about it being spread into crystal meth, into cocaine, being spread to heroin, of course. Twice in roundtable discussions I've had and with community leaders, I've heard one from a police chief, one from a sheriff, both very similar stories about a young man who wakes up from an overdose after being saved through Narcan, this miracle drug that reverses the effects of an overdose. And when the young man comes to, he says, I was just smoking pot. How did I overdose? And in both cases, based on the forensics, the information that they were able to get from the labs, they found out, of course, that it wasn't just marijuana. It was marijuana laced with fentanyl. So no street drug is safe. They can all kill you. As I've met with these first responders, community leaders, and those in recovery across Ohio, as I just did recently with a group called Prevention First, I've heard what is often brought up by those on the front lines, and that is that we would be making so much more progress right now on this war against opioids, that we've been successful here in this Congress in passing more money for prevention and treatment and recovery. Those funds are starting to be used back home, and I see it. I see the results, and there's some really exciting stuff going on. But for the fentanyl, in other words, just as we were finally making progress on prescription drugs and then on heroin, now this fentanyl comes in and is creating even more problems. It's so inexpensive and it's so pervasive. Recently in Ohio, there were 2 busts where they were able to apprehend people who were selling fentanyl and find this cache of fentanyl that they had. In both cases, it was a massive amount. Combined, just these 2 busts alone, enough fentanyl to kill half the people who live in my state of Ohio. That's how bad it is. Just last week, there was an autopsy that revealed that the death of an Ohio police chief from Kirkersville in the Columbus area was caused by fentanyl. The report said, and I quote, acute intoxication by fentanyl. It was an accidental overdose. I've told before the story about the police officer who brushed a couple of flakes off of his shirt after a bust, didn't know it was fentanyl. Those flakes were the drug. It got into his skin through his fingers. He dropped to the ground unconscious, had an overdose, and it took several doses of Narcan to save his life. Our first responders are also in much more danger now with fentanyl than they have ever been, even with heroin and prescription drugs and other opioids. Addiction has taken too many lives in Ohio, and again, fentanyl is the deadliest drug in this epidemic. There was a recent estimation by a group called the Ohio Alliance for Innovation in Population Health, which suggested that opioids are responsible for more than 500,000 years of life expectancy lost in Ohio between 2010 and 2016. Think about that. 500,000 years of lost life due to opioids in Ohio just in the 6 years between 2010 and 2016. These are often lives of young people who had great promise ahead of them, and they become involved in this opioid epidemic, and the addiction takes over, and it's more important than anything. It's more important than their family, more important than their friends, more important than their job, more important than their faith, more important than taking care of themselves, and they end up, sadly, losing their lives and all that opportunity and all the purpose that God had for them in their lives. So we need to turn the tide on this opioid epidemic. We can't do it, in my view, unless we get at this issue of fentanyl, because that's the big new scourge. And we need to look at how it's coming, why it's so cheap. Well, here's what's very interesting and might be surprising to some people. It's not coming across the border from Mexico. Or if it is, it's very little of it. That's where the heroin's coming from, about 90% of it probably. More pure than ever, more dangerous than ever. But the fentanyl, this deadly fentanyl, is mostly coming through the mail system. It's being mailed into the United States of America, mostly from overseas, mostly from China. So there are some evil scientists somewhere in China making this fentanyl and then shipping it into your community. And it's the #1 killer right now. And by the way, opioid overdose and deaths is the #1 cause of death in my home state of Ohio. And nationally, it's now the #1 cause of death, I'm told, among people under 50 years old. So it's surpassed car accidents. It's an epidemic. So how could that be, and what can we do about it? Well, there is something we can do about it. We got to be sure that the post office helps law enforcement to find these packages as they're coming in and to get these packages out of circulation so they don't come into our communities and poison our families, our children, our neighbors. We have legislation to do that. It's called the STOP Act. 1/3 of the members of the Senate have now co-sponsored that legislation. We've now had it reported out of the Finance Committee of the United States Senate. We need to get it to the floor and get it to a vote. It's really very simple. It's legislation that Amy Klobuchar, a Democrat in Minnesota, the side of the aisle, and I have come up with that says the post office should have to do what any other carrier would have to do. FedEx, UPS, DHL, which is under law, they have to tell law enforcement in advance what packages are coming in, where they're coming from, what's in it, where it's going. And you have to provide that electronically so you can use big data to be able to sift through the millions of packages that come in and to be able to find ones that are suspect. And then immediately use sophisticated equipment to scan those and screen those and to pull, again, those out of circulation that have fentanyl. I've been to these distribution centers for these private carrier companies. I've seen how they do it. I've seen the dangerous work that the Customs and Border Protection men and women are doing, usually in a room that has significant ventilation, and they have to have masks on and gloves. They have to be very careful about it. But thank God they're there because they're saving lives. But if you send it through the mail system, that very rarely happens. We did a year-long study of this in our subcommittee, permanent subcommittee investigations I talked about earlier, and we found a number of things that were very troubling. One is just how easy it is to buy fentanyl online. But second is the fact that these drugs, when they come in through the post office, it's guaranteed delivery. The traffickers will say if you send it by FedEx or another private carrier, UPS, again, DHL and others, it's not guaranteed. But if you send it through the government agency, no problem. That's not the way it should be. And by the way, letter carriers,
what was the first
the mail carriers in my community and your community, they want this fixed too. Because they care about what comes into their communities. They care about the people who they serve, and they want to be sure that they're not delivering poison. They also are at risk, just like anybody else is who's anywhere in that train. I talked about the law enforcement officers, but think of the other first responders who are using Narcan to revive people. They sometimes get exposed to it. We have too many stories of kids, little kids dying from being accidentally exposed to fentanyl in a home where someone is using it. It's just dangerous stuff, so we've got to fix this. The information as to where it's from, where it's going, and what's in it, when it's put into a digital format and can be analyzed, can quickly, through incredible intelligence that our Customs and Border Protection people have, be able to determine whether that package is suspect or not. And that will make a huge difference in taking this offline, in keeping this poison coming into our communities, and ensuring that we can, in fact, begin to stop some of the poison, but at a minimum, raise the price by reducing the supply. The Post Office, frankly, because of the pressure that they've gotten from Congress on this over the last few years, have begun to start to look at some of this. They've begun to provide some of the electronic data based on testimony that they provided for our subcommittee just recently. They are now receiving data on about 36% of the international packages they transport into the country. Unfortunately, of that 36%, just over a third, about 80% of those packages are presented to law enforcement, 20% get lost and end up going into the system, into our communities, even though we know they're suspect. So it's very inefficient right now. It's not working well, plus some of the data is not decipherable. So we have a long way to go. Even if all 36% was being delivered to law enforcement, that would mean that 318 million international packages each year was coming in without any screening. 318 million packages. So the STOP Act is very simple. It just holds the post office to the same standard as private carriers, 100% screening, and requires that by 2020 they get all this data on all the international packages entering the United States. It's a common sense solution. It's already passed the House of Representatives recently with a broad bipartisan vote. Our committee has reported it out. We need to get it to the floor and get it voted on. If we do so, by the way, it will be signed, because the administration has already issued a statement of administration policy on it, which supports the legislation. It was actually a recommendation of the President's Commission on Opioids. It's part of the solution. Is it the whole solution? No. But it's a critical part right now to try to stop some of this new poison, this fentanyl, from coming into our communities, the #1 killer, so that we can, through treatment and recovery and through better prevention efforts and better other law enforcement efforts, truly begin to turn the tide on this opioid epidemic. It's critical we do so for so many reasons we've talked about this afternoon. And my hope is that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will come together, at least on this issue, on the STOP Act, and say, yes, we can do something to help those in our community who are suffering, those who are dying from overdoses, those families who are looking to us and saying, what can you do to help? I run into them all the time. Today, I'm heading back to Ohio, and I know that this weekend I will be talking to people in Cleveland and Cincinnati, where I'll be in Columbus, and they will be telling me about it. This week, I was walking down the hall back to my office on Tuesday, and a young man came up to me and said, I just want to talk to you about something, and I figured he was with the media. I wanted to ask me a question. I stopped and asked him what he wanted, and he said, I just wanted to tell you thank you. And he started to well up, you know. And I knew what he was talking about. I knew what he was talking about. And he was talking about a family member of his who had overdosed and died. And he was talking about the fact that he appreciates that the Congress is finally beginning to respond to this issue. As we have. In the last year and a half, we have passed legislation that is historic here to deal with this issue. But there's so much more to do. Let's make the next step getting the STOP Act enacted into law, and therefore be able to save lives and help people be able to live their God-given purpose in life. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Yes, ma'am. Hold on. Let me log you in first. Then you can log in.
Show me out with the units on Lakeside.
Okay.
And can you tell me what time the
Units came out here.
Stand by, let me pull it up and log you in and put you on the call.
Sure.
Goals. She's still on the road. She's still in the lane. Not much off the road, she stated.
10-4, she's at 77 in McGee, it looks like. County Road 42, 77 in McGee.
Yes, ma'am, that's a 10-4. That's right before or after the curve, I understand. I'm headed that way.
She's going to be right before that curve onto Avenue E, sir.
10-4, thank you. 2:11 a.m.
Moving to 11, 10-4. 7-1.
7-1.
This is headed out with unit 1019 for 1009. Also, 719 is going to be swapped out with 715.
10-4, thank you.
Morgan, contact Audrey Aguirre. Advising that the employee advised the subject is throwing rocks and is arguing with several customers.
1217 18th Street. 1217 18th Street. The contact with Jessica Reyes.
Not a road where the next 27 coming can make it around the other unit, the 1024 unit.
424 dash 478 red reduce dash 03 0 dash 0 Florida Class E.
Okay. It's going to be unit 1010. 1010.
10-4, unit 1010. Let me give him a heads up.
180.
597, you're in line. Airport 53, what is his first name?
First name should be Jonathan.
Flight waiting for him? Let me know. Let me let him know. Route 4.
They're still on board.
Okay, after you finish those two, can you go pick up at Holly Park? They're 7:45 ready. And June Herrera, they're back to back, close to each other. Before you get your 8:30.
50.
I need to enter motorcycle that was stolen.
Go.
You can transfer those two to Route 4, and I'm going to send you the ones I have on request.
All right, 10-4. I'll call you back in a little bit when I'm in motion right now so I can get the information. And thank you, Route 4.
Support, thank you very much. Okay, she already transferred the request.
4 suspicious and 2 disturbed.
I'm going to drop them down after CC Adult Daycare, or before Brush.
Yeah, 10-4. I'll call you back. I just dropped off at CC Adult Daycare. I'll call you
go back in,
back from everyone so I
go
can get
back
the information.
in. So, he told me to turn the meter on. I got 3 out and I'm leaving. I ain't talking, playing games.
2-1. Sissy bar, any other distinguishing markings?
No, that's it. That's all it has.
Was taken last night at 22:45?
Yeah, 22:45 till he discovered it this morning, which was 6 o'clock.
Temper, it's going to be entered by Alvarado 11907. Alvarado 11907, and I'll put it in your call also.
Yes, please put it on the notes so I can copy and paste.
Still support on my part.
Yes.
Okay.
1306 traffic. FM 70, Highway 77, Compass Bank, parking lot, Texas LP, King, Mary,
Negative, she's
William,
NCIC ID card that is
555.
clear. Compass Bank, FM 70 and Highway 77.
and Grant. I got Alice and Aspen Grove.
As well.
You can take Nogales from Route 21
no driver's
get that pyramid.
Fire registration, negative PCIC and CIC.
We can help in over here, and Robert and Emma probably going to need some help if we find it.
Nothing. Check the loading dock and I check the front door. Everything's secure. Show me quick. Buffalo.
Oh, okay, 10-4. I had logged out, but you didn't take me off of it. But yeah, 2034. I'll get the information later because I'm driving right now.
Hey, you never left the yard in that bus, right?
No, negative. But I still did it on my paperwork. That it was a 1024 in the yard.
20, standby.
Coleman, Brenda, 92965.
Standby, advise to standby.
Sorry, I hit that on him.
Supervisor on.
Morganson, Staples, 10-4. Delta 1, Adam unit was looking for you. 2597, you're in line. Adam 120, that was Brenda Coleman, 929-55.
65.
10-4, 929-65, standby.
Here, right.
4514 Cobblestone. 4514 Cobblestone Lane.
Johnston call 4814
For
Johnston.
Martin Ramirez and Anthony Brown. They're both going to Bruce. 5866 Everhart.
22 to Bay. 10-7 on Holly Road.
10-4. And he's not going to need assistance with the one on Coventry, you said?
He said he will pick him up. I forgot who it was called. Lisa, route 17. Right for private.
601, 1044.
Go ahead and bring it on in. Hold on, route 17, when are you going to pick up the one on Grant? Right now? I mean, not right now. After brush?
I'll get them after brush. I'll go get those first and then get the other two.
I lost one.
Where are they?
I have three up here. I lost one. Hold on, I'm going to need you to put you in a private, but I need all units to clear the air for just a second. I need to check out two routes back to back. Hold on.
Hey, you said Cobblestone was 8 o'clock?
For Charles Adam, Sam, Adam Norris, David, Robert Adam.
The, I guess, consumers that is falling through the cracks doesn't meet the criteria for warrantless, but and also does not want to go voluntarily, but is right on in the crack and just constantly I guess harassing business owners in the area. 10-4. Is it that?
Dropping off right now at 10th Street.
Alright, let me look at around. All the trips are performed. Route 819, where are you at?
I just picked up Devonshire and I'm on my way for Windy Way.
10-4, thank you.
Most of you are going to be in Brush in just after Kushna, you're going to be there after Littleton. So all units stand by. Route 19, stand by for a private.
Tell me how to that.
Yes. Second boy, Young 5, 5506.
FM 17, Highway 77. 1930.
Yeah, by chance, is there a way you could check to see if last night they had a call at 4101 for a theft?
Next one's going to be King Lincoln Robert 7796. King Lincoln Robert 7796.
Red Morgan and Leopard.
14th up arrive. 14th up arrive, I arrived CDT, right?
1530, I got one more. John Nora Robert
14, show me en route
557.
to, leave me on the call, I'm going to be back en route to Wilkins to drop off property. 19, I'm not going to go code.
What?
120, change the same job.
Okay. What's that, Gamboa? 841 East Avenue A, Robstown. On a white and black 03 Honda CRV to Sonia Rodriguez, 868 West Avenue East, Edward, Robstown. Jose Lopez or Brittany Anderson, 307 May Street, Robstown.
Like every other time you key up.
10-4, thank you.
I'm just used to saying 430. I think I said 410. Adam 110 or 120. What time we in? 11:10. I open.
10103 North End.
Got a warrant or what? Yeah.
10-4,
Juvenile warrant.
417, go ahead.
No.
You give me 2 add-ons on Grant Place? Where it is, I was looking for them. No, I didn't give them to you. I had your screen up because I thought it was Lisa's, and I accidentally dropped them on yours, but I was looking for Lisa's. Hold on, I forget you're 17.
Over there to you. You got his name?
5 is what she gave us. Did you find?
Just by the HEB sign on the SPID side exit. Muffled and unreadable. In regards to Manuel Castro. 140, I didn't get any of your traffic, just Manuel Castro.
TLC, Captain, she doesn't really cause disturbances. She talks to herself. She talks to people that aren't here, and then she scares the crap out of the customers that are here.